What's up, everybody? This is Jason, and you're listening to the Unsung Podcast. What you're about to hear is part 3 of American Guerrillas, a multi-part series covering the Kansas territorial period and the Kansas-Missouri border war. If you haven't heard the first 2 parts yet, I'd suggest you go listen to those first, or you'll be a little lost in the beginning of this one. This is the part 2B that I promised last time. It's just called episode 3. We're just going to use numbers. One thing to mention before we get started, it's been brought to my attention that I made a small mistake in part 1. When I was talking about the border states, the slave states that remained loyal to the Union, I said there were 3, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. There were actually 4. Delaware was one too, which I forgot about. In my defense, nobody really cares about Delaware anyway. I mean, I've been there and I'm still not convinced it's a real place. Anyway, I don't have too much else to say to introduce this one, other than, as usual, if you appreciate this show and you'd like to donate to help me do more of these, stick around to the very end after the outro music to hear about how you can do that. And without further ado, American Guerrillas, Part 3. Here we go.
Are you gonna pull those pistols or whistle Dixie? If I get to liking someone, they ain't around long.
I notice when you get to disliking someone, they ain't around for long either.
Pretty sure we have time to bury them, fellas.
Hell with them fellas. Buzzards gotta eat, same as worms.
The massacre of 5 pro-slavery settlers along Pottawatomie Creek sent shockwaves through both Kansas territory and Missouri. Like I said at the end of part 2, Brown and his boys had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. It's not that people hadn't already died in the territory before this. It's not that people hadn't already been attacked or harassed in their homes. It's not that people hadn't already been killed for their views on the slavery issue. At least once in a pretty shockingly grisly manner in the case of Reese Brown. But there was something different about the Pottawatomie murders. It's a little hard to put your finger on what precisely the difference was, but I think it's about the combination of the goriness of it, the cold-bloodedness, and the fact that these murders were committed at people's homes during the night. I mean, the idea that someone could just show up at your house in the middle of the night and do something like that would be nerve-wracking to anyone, doubly so given the polarized and politically charged atmosphere. The restraining fear that John Jr. spoke of took hold among many pro-slavery settlers in the region, especially the ones in the area immediately around Dutch Henry's Crossing. Many called it quits and fled the territory, and maybe a bit counterintuitively, so did many Free State settlers, likely out of fear of the pro-slavery reprisals they anticipated. From Goodrich, quote, "Like a violent earth tremor, shockwaves of terror rolled over the border. While many Southern settlers fled the territory without a backward glance, not a few Free Soilers, fearing retaliation, packed their bags and left as well. For those who remained, life became a horrifying hour-by-hour ordeal. I never lie down," one pro-slavery man admitted, "without taking the precaution to fasten my door and fix it in such a way that if it is forced open, it can be opened only wide enough for one person to come in at a time. I have my rifle, revolver, and pistol where I can lay my hand on them in an instant, besides a hatchet and axe. Pottawatomie is in much fear and excitement," reported a resident from that New England colony. "All work is nearly suspended. The women are in constant fear." "All here is excitement and confusion," echoed a dweller in Paola to the north. When details of the slaughter reached the largest town in the territory, Leavenworth, the already crazed population were swept by a fury of hate and revenge. George Washington Brown later spoke with a woman there. Now quoting Brown, "She said a body of armed men marched through the streets, visiting each dwelling, and ordered every Free State man, woman, and child to go at once to the levee. They would not allow her even to close her house, but with her children she was marched to the river, where she found hundreds of others. All were forced upon a steamer lying at the levee, including her husband, whom she found there. The captain was ordered to take these involuntary passengers to Alton, Illinois, and there leave them." Back to Goodrich. Still a captive in the city, Charles Robinson counted his life not in hours, but in seconds. "It was all that active pro-slavery men could do to save him from violent death," Brown continued. "Indeed, the people were wrought up to such a furious frenzy that his death was expected at any moment." Wild with excitement, those downriver in Kansas City were whipped to madness with each new report. "The killing of the 5 men, harrowing enough in its true details," declared a witness, "was magnified as to numbers and exaggerated in atrocity as the rumors were repeated. With every fresh rumor, the papers were issuing inflammatory extras. These were scattered throughout the crowds and on the steamboats as they landed." End quote. The restraining fear didn't extend very far, it seems. The main reaction to the massacre was not one of fear, but of rage. From Horwitz, quote, "Let slip the dogs of war," read the headline in a Missouri border paper reporting on the deaths. Up to that point, the Kansas conflict had generated a great deal of heat but relatively little bloodshed. Now, in a single strike, Brown had almost doubled the body count and inflamed his already rabid foes, who needed little spur to violence. Not for the last time, Brown acted as an accelerant, igniting a much broader and bloodier conflict than had flared before. He wanted to hurry up the fight, always, Salmon Brown observed of his father. "We struck merely to begin the fight that we saw was being forced upon us." End quote. Besides igniting the tinderbox of Kansas territory, the massacre took a personal toll on the Brown family themselves. Most of their cabins were burned soon after by pro-slavery militias, and the old man and his sons went on the run. It was during this time that Brown met Redpath and started his PR campaign to paint himself as a righteous freedom fighter. If John Brown himself wasn't crazy, the same can't be said of some of his sons. Frederick in particular was apparently not all that stable to begin with. John Brown wrote that about a year before coming to Kansas, Frederick had, quote, "subjected himself to a most dreadful surgical operation, his taking away of the greater part of the blank." End quote. And Horwitz says he's talking about self-castration. And it seems the traumatic nature of the murders he had just taken part in might have pushed him over the edge. Redpath recounts his meeting with Frederick when he first stumbled into the Brown camp near Palmyra, along Ottawa Creek. Quote, "Suddenly, 30 paces before me, I saw a wild-looking man with half a dozen pistols of various sizes stuck in his belt, and a large Arkansas bowie knife prominent among them. His head was uncovered, his hair was uncombed, his face had not been shaved for many months. We were similarly dressed, with red-topped boots worn over the pantaloons, a coarse blue shirt, and a pistol belt. 'Hello,' he cried, 'you're in our camp.' He had nothing in his right hand. He carried a water pail in his left, but before he could speak again, I had drawn and cocked my 8-inch Colt. I only answered, 'Halt, or I'll fire.' He stopped and said that he knew me, that he had seen me in Lawrence, and that I was true. He was Frederick Brown, the son of old John Brown, and that I was now within the limits of their camp. After a parley of a few minutes, I was satisfied that I was among my friends, put up my pistol, and shook hands with Frederick. He talked wildly, as he walked before me, turning round every minute, as he spoke of the recent affair of Pottawatomie. His family, he said, had been accused of it. He denied it indignantly, with the wild air of a maniac. His excitement was so great that he repeatedly recrossed the creek, until, getting anxious to reach the camp, I refused to listen to him until he took me to his father." End quote. Owen, too, was greatly affected by the killings. From Horwitz, quote, Owen Brown, the oldest son present, was initially opposed to taking part, but later said he was swayed by his father, who thought it a matter of duty that there should be a little bloodletting. After the massacre, Owen felt terribly conscience-stricken because he had killed one of the Doyles, Salmon said. He cried and took on at an agonizing rate. End quote. Even John Jr. and Jason were affected, even though they weren't present for the killings, just through the shock of realizing that their father and brothers could commit such horrendous acts. Goodrich quotes a friend of the Browns who said, quote, "After intelligence was received in camp of the massacre, John immediately mounted his horse, and the greatest possible excitement, ordered his company to disband and rode towards Pottawatomie. The reports of the awful murder of his neighbors, the consciousness that his father had been guilty of that terrible outrage, and the treatment he received at Pottawatomie from his own political friends, crazed him. He sought the woods and wandered about for days, with only an occasional gleam of recollection. He became tangled in the brushwood, waded streams, sometimes out upon the open prairie, and imagining crowds pursuing him. A severe storm of rain and lightning came on, and he thought, in the flashes, he could see his pursuers." End quote. I haven't seen quite so thorough a description of how Jason was affected, but he seems to have just about lost his wits too. Sometime during his wanderings, John Jr. was caught and captured by a pro-slavery posse hunting for the Browns. He was viciously beaten and chained in jail at Tecumseh, where he ended up being held for 3 months on charges of treason. Jason also ended up being captured and held alongside his brother. Brown's massacre had touched off a full-blown guerrilla war in the region between Pottawatomie and Lawrence. Militia bands from Missouri were coming over the border to help their pro-slavery allies in the territory enact reprisals against Free Staters for the massacre. Free Staters were forming into their own bands for defense and for counterattack against the pro-slave settlers in the area. It's no surprise that John Brown himself was now public enemy number one for the Missourians, and that many Missourians would be gunning for him. One such Missourian was Henry Clay Pate. Pate was a reporter for the pro-slavery newspaper, the St. Louis Republican, and might have seen an opportunity to make a name for himself by taking out the now notorious Brown. In the first week after the massacre, he led a band of about 25 men into the territory, and they were the ones who burned the Brown homes and captured Jason and John Jr. But the old man still eluded them. After turning the captured sons over to federal troops, they moved northwest toward Lawrence to continue the hunt. On May 31st, they camped at Blackjack, which was the easternmost of a line of 4 settlements situated along the Santa Fe Road, the other 3 being from east to west, Palmyra, Prairie City, and Hickory Point. Those are all in the neighborhood of modern-day Baldwin City, roughly along the line of Highway 56. From the camp of Blackjack the next day, Pate sent out scouts to try to locate Brown. A group of 6 rode west, found Palmyra deserted and looted some homes there, then moved on to Prairie City where they interrupted a Sunday morning church service. Goodrich quotes George Griffith, a man in the congregation of that church when the Pate scouts rode up. Quote, "During the course of his sermon, an excitement in the congregation suddenly broke out. Many men jumped up and ran for their guns which they had deposited in the corner as they came in. On going to the door, I saw 6 men riding up, armed and in line. When the men rushed out with their guns cocked, 4 of these men surrendered, but 2 in the rear turned and fled as fast as their horses could run, with bullets from our churchmen's guns tearing up the dust in their front, rear, and sides." End quote. Well, the people of Prairie City talked to the prisoners they'd just taken and sent word to Brown that Pate was nearby. Brown was not one to back down from a fight like this one was shaping up to be, and he was in Prairie City by the end of the day. He and the dozen or so men he had with him were joined by Samuel Shore and 19 other Free Staters from the nearby settlements, and together they rode off towards Blackjack to look for Pate. They found him around 6 a.m. the next morning, June 2nd. Now, the fight we're about to talk about is the first event from this period that you could really call a field battle. It'll become known as the Battle of Blackjack. But I'll keep repeating this as we go. few, if any, of the men involved in any of these battles are actually soldiers. I'll be reading plenty of first-hand accounts, and in many of those, some of the leaders involved will style themselves with military titles like Captain Brown or Captain Shore. Just keep in mind those are informal titles. They're only captains in the sense that they're the leaders of their little bands of men, who usually number less than 20 or so. Basically, none of these men hold any actual rank in any organized military, with a couple of exceptions, which will be obvious when we get to them. That'll remain true right up until what we think of as the Civil War proper kicks off in 1861, and even then, there will still be a lot of this informal title stuff. So when it comes to battles in Kansas Territory in the 1850s, you should really think of them almost always as being less like organized military engagements and more akin to Wild West cowboy shootouts, but with more primitive weapons. We talked about the Sharps rifle in Part 1. There would have been a fair number of those that had made their way into the territory by now, mostly on the Free State side, but remember, the Missouri militia confiscated quite a few at the sacking of Lawrence, so they would have had some too. But still, most of the long arms would have been muzzleloaders. Pistols were a little bit different. You did have revolvers by this time, but they were still kind of primitive. The first revolver to use metallic cartridges was the Smith & Wesson Model 1, which wasn't produced until 1857. If you've ever fired a modern revolver, you loaded it with metallic cartridges. You know, the bullet, charge, and primers all there in one convenient package. You load 6 of them into the chambers. Once you fired them all, you eject the spent casings and reload, and it's pretty fast. Well, before metallic cartridges, revolvers fired pistol balls. There was no cartridge. You'd have to load each chamber separately with a powder charge, bullet, and separate percussion cap as primer. It would be just like loading a muzzleloader, except you'd be loading 6 chambers in a cylinder instead of 1 barrel. That operation obviously takes a lot longer than loading a metallic cartridge revolver, and for that reason you'll see guys in this period carrying not just 1 or 2 revolvers, but as many as they can carry. For example, in the Redpath quote I read a little while ago, he described Frederick Brown as carrying half a dozen pistols on his person. Reloading a cap and ball pistol is not really something you'd want to have to do in the middle of a gunfight, and so, if you carry 2 pistols instead of 1, you've just doubled the number of rounds you can fire before you have to reload. If you carry half a dozen revolvers, well, hopefully you have enough rounds to get you all the way through a gunfight without having to reload at all. Then you can reload all your weapons later at your leisure once the fight is over. The reason I bring that up is that for as much fighting as there ends up being in Kansas at this time, and there will be a lot, it can be a little surprising how few people actually end up getting killed and wounded. There will be some, of course, but maybe not as many as you'd expect. And the reason for that, I think, is the lack of military training, the weapons of the time, which naturally limit the amount of lead you can put down range, and obviously the small numbers of people involved to begin with. The lack of military training also helps explain what happened at the opening of the Battle of Blackjack. See, these battles, or gunfights, aren't like the movies where the time has come in the story when it's time for a gunfight, and so the two sides come together and have a shootout until somebody wins. No, in real life, it takes some impetus or motive to get men to fight. In John Keegan's book, The Face of Battle, he calls this the will to combat. It's the drive that motivates men to be willing to risk their lives in combat. That can take a lot of forms. High-minded ideals like faith, defense of one's homeland, or loyalty to a king. More down-to-earth motives like a desire for plunder, a sense of camaraderie with fellow soldiers, or the conditioning of military training. If at any point a man's fear of death or maiming, or maybe his aversion to killing his fellow man, becomes stronger than whatever his will to combat is, he'll flee the battle or surrender. Armies through the ages have had to deal with this problem, and they've all had to come up with various ways of motivating their soldiers to fight. When a war like this one gets started, when almost no one on either side has any military training, the men are left without any factors like military conditioning and discipline to motivate them to fight. all this driving them is whatever other motives they came in with. For a guy like John Brown, the motive is clear. He was on what he saw as his divinely commanded mission, which is maybe the strongest possible motive you could think of. His sons and close followers would have had some of that to one degree or another. Maybe also throw in the fact that they were all notorious after the Pottawatomie Massacre, and must have had some idea that if they were ever captured by Missourians, it wasn't going to go well for them. But if you were a Free Stater not directly associated with Brown, especially if you were a moderate Free Stater and not a radical abolitionist with a strong ideological motive, you might be less willing to risk your life. It's easy to talk big and aggressive when you're among friends, but when the bullets start flying, it gets real all of a sudden. Well, Samuel Shore and his men were of that stripe, and their reaction to the opening shots helped set the stage for John Brown's growing legend. Exact numbers are hard to come by, but Pate had something like 25 to 30 men with him originally, now slightly reduced by the 4 prisoners taken at Prairie City. Brown's original band had about a dozen, and once they were joined by Shore and his 19 men, they slightly outnumbered Pate's group. That is, until the shooting started. At around 6 a.m., the Free Staters dismounted and advanced toward Pate's camp, when they soon ran into fire from Pate's pickets. August Bondy, one of Brown's men, tells us what happened next. Quote, Captain Brown called out, "Now follow me," and downhill he and his company started in a run. We had not yet come down half the hill when we were greeted with shots of the Missouri pickets, and at the same time we heard the guns of Shore's men replying behind us. Soon the Missourians sent whole volleys against us, but on charged Brown's company. When we arrived at the foot of the hill, we saw before us the old Santa Fe road. Captain Brown jumped into the old washed-out trail and commanded, "Halt! Down!" His companions followed his example. Now we saw that not a man of Captain Shore's company, except for Captain Shore himself, had followed downhill. Most of them had already disappeared. A few were yet on the brow of the hill wasting ammunition, and very soon those also retired in the direction of their comrades. End quote. Shore soon hightailed it along with his men, and without them, Brown was now outnumbered 2-1. But, like we said, he had about the strongest will to combat you could possibly think of, and wasn't about to give up the fight. He kept advancing on Pate's camp, losing at least 1 man wounded on the way in and wounding 5 Missourians. Bondy continues, quote, It might have been about 9 o'clock in the forenoon when Captain Brown stopped near me and Wiener, and after having looked through his spyglass at the enemy's position for quite a while, he said, "It seems the Missourians have also suffered from our fire. They are leaving one by one. We must never allow this. We must try and surround them. We must compel them to surrender." He then walked down our line, spoke with some of the men, and returned with the Moore boys to where Wiener and myself were posted, and beckoned us to follow him. We ran up a hill south of the Missouri camp. As soon as we had gained a commanding position within 200 yards of the enemy, Captain Brown ordered the 2 Moors to aim with their carbines at horses and mules exclusively. The Moore boys with 4 shots killed 2 mules and 2 horses, which we could perceive created great consternation in the Missouri camp, and we saw several leaving. Now Captain Brown drew and cocked his revolver, and declared that he would advance some 20 yards by himself, and if then he would wave his hat, we should follow. Then Goodrich continues the account. Before the charge could begin, however, Brown's unbalanced son, Fred, galloped over the prairie in full view of both parties. "Father, we have them surrounded and have cut off their communications," the boy screamed deliriously as he swung his sword in the air. The strain of battle followed by the strange apparition was simply too much for Pate. From the ravine a white flag went up, and the Missourians marched out to surrender. It was only then, when the bloody and beaten border ruffians were disarmed, that they learned to their horror into whose hands they had fallen. Much to the prisoners' surprise and relief, though, they were given water, had their wounds attended to, and were kindly treated in general. Soon some captives even felt safe enough to engage in banter. Remembered Free Stater Luke Parsons. Now quoting Parsons, I said to a wounded Southerner as he lay in the grass, "You had better let me have those spurs, as you won't need them anymore." He said, "You will have to take them off." I stooped down and took one off, and asked him where the other was. He replied, "I go on the principle that if one side of the horse goes, the other must. If you will adopt this plan, you won't need but one." End quote. Pate would later famously report to his newspaper, quote, "I went to take Old Brown, and Old Brown took me." End quote. Fortunately for him, though, he didn't have to stay in Brown's custody for long. The regular U.S. Army did have forces in the area, and although they were of a strength completely inadequate to deal with the trouble that was now breaking out, a column of cavalry under Colonel Edwin Sumner rode up on Brown's band just a couple of days after Blackjack and forced him to release his prisoners. Sumner was on police duty at the behest of Governor Shannon, a duty which he apparently disliked strongly, and in everything I've read about him, he just seems annoyed that he has to do it. But Shannon needed to do something. This was an election year, after all. He was an appointment of the current Democratic President Franklin Pierce, and all national eyes were on Kansas. From Monahan, quote, "The capture of Pate caused wide publicity, and vengeful Missourians rallied at Westport and Independence. At Lexington, wealthy young Joe Shelby, who had just returned from Lawrence, wheeled his troop and started back. Other companies mustered in Jackson, Johnson, Clay, Platte, Ray, Saline, and Carroll counties. To defend Brown, the Lawrence Stubbs shouldered arms and swung down the road to Blackjack. On other roads came the Bloomington Rifles, the Blue Mound Infantry, Wakarusa Boys, the Prairie City Company, about 115 men in all. Governor Shannon was desperate. He knew the Democratic Convention was in session in Cincinnati, and that he, as well as Pierce, would be blamed for all the turmoil. On June 4th, he issued a proclamation ordering all armed and illegal organizations to disperse, then cautioned Colonel Sumner to see that it was obeyed. With 2 companies of regulars, the colonel approached the woods where Brown's men were bivouacked. The bull of the woods was engaged, at last, in the police work he detested. A messenger from Brown met him in the dusty road with a request for a conference. "Tell him I make no terms with lawless men," Sumner replied. There was no question in his mind about his military duty. Then Old Brown himself stepped into the road and beckoned the soldiers back through the brush to his camp. The prisoners were called out and told that they were free. Henry Clay Pate bounded up on a log and began to speak. "I don't want to hear a word from you, sir," Sumner snapped. "You have no business here. The governor told me so." The colonel then ordered both prisoners and captors to disperse and go home. Brown's party protested. They explained that several hundred men were marching in from Missouri to kill them all. In fact, were only 2 miles away. Colonel Sumner was not one to leave the men helpless. He sent at once for reinforcements for his own troops, then rode to the invaders' lines, ordering them all to go home. Captain Joe Shelby, still glorying in military activity, reported that Sumner had come with 2,500 men from Leavenworth and drove me clear out of the territory. The beginning of a hatred of the Federal Army that would lead to exciting days. Neither the Free State nor the Missouri Army had supplies, and they returned home, plundering along the way. Everyone learned how easy it was to live by looting. Brown, with his men, continued to skulk in the brush. End quote. Well, on the national politics front, the war in Kansas was definitely having an effect. Pierce had now presided over an eruption of violence in a new territory that threatened to spark a wider civil war, and he'd appointed now 2 territorial governors who had failed to keep things under control. Shannon was still desperately holding things together, but everyone could see that his grip was slipping, and it didn't help his case that Pierce and everyone else knew how easily he'd been manipulated at Lawrence by Robinson and the other Free State leaders. For the Democrats, all that added up to the conclusion that Pierce wasn't their guy. Even though he was a first-term president, they ousted him and nominated James Buchanan, a Northern Democrat, for the 1856 election. His main opponent would be Republican John C. Fremont, who we mentioned briefly in the California troubles from 1850. As the election drew closer, the pressure was on Shannon to hold things together well enough so that the Democrat-supported Kansas-Nebraska Act wouldn't look like a complete failure. Meanwhile, many of the Free State prisoners in Kansas, including Robinson, George Washington Brown, Jason Brown, and John Jr., were moved to Lecompton, where they were treated surprisingly well by all accounts, despite the outcry in the pro-slavery town after the Pottawatomie Massacre. John Jr. continued to rant and rave, according to George Washington Brown, quote, "He became an occupant of my tent and remained with me some time after he was brought into camp. His mind seemed continually running on the Pottawatomie Massacre. During the entire period he was with us, whenever that event was mentioned in his hearing, his eyes would flash and sparkle like a madman's. He would exhibit the wildest excitement and express himself in the severest terms at the enormity of the outrage." End quote. Just down the road to the west, in Topeka, the illegal Free State legislature was preparing to meet as scheduled in early July. Despite what had happened in Lawrence, despite the fact that their governor was in jail along with many other leaders of their movement, and despite the general atmosphere of a territorial-level civil war brewing, they forged on ahead. Their session was scheduled to start on July 4th, the 80th anniversary of U.S. independence from Britain, and don't think for a second that the symbolism of that was lost on anyone involved. It certainly wasn't lost on Shannon, and he understood that a new independence movement in his territory during an election year was not a good look for his party. He ordered the reluctant Colonel Sumner with 5 companies of federal cavalry and 2 field guns to go to Topeka and disperse the illegal government by force if necessary. John Brown got wind that Sumner was marching toward Topeka, and far from being deterred by the possibility of a fight with federal troops, he was eager for it. He took his guerrilla band, who had been living, according to a letter he wrote to his wife around this time, quote, "like David of old, with the serpents of the rocks and wild beasts of the wilderness," end quote, and hid out in the brush along Shunganunga Creek south of town. It wasn't just the Free State legislature that had showed up in Topeka. Many Free State settlers from the surrounding region had come for the festivities, and with them was their militia, as they prepared to resist the tyranny of the bogus legislature, now backed by federal troops. On the morning of July 4th, Sam Walker recalled, quote, "Fiery speeches were made and grand resolutions passed. They would willingly die on the altar of freedom, but would never retreat or surrender. One fine speaker was especially eloquent and brave. He soared aloft like the eagle, and in words of burning patriotism exclaimed, 'The eyes of the world are upon us. We represent a great cause, and must be true to it. I know not what others may do, but as for me, I will never leave this hall except at the point of the bayonet.'" End quote. The Free State legislature met in Constitution Hall, a building that still stands today, actually, at the corner of 5th and Kansas Avenue. The streets were lined with people watching the militia companies parade up and down to the sound of fifes and drums. Israel Donaldson, U.S. Marshal for the territory, walked into Constitution Hall and presented the legislators with a written order directly from President Pierce, ordering them not to convene. When it didn't appear they would disperse, he walked back out of the building and reported to Sumner. Around noon, Sumner marched his men up Kansas Avenue to enforce the order. Goodrich quotes an eyewitness in the crowd who wrote, quote, "The street was filled with a crowd, among whom were many ladies and children, when Colonel Sumner appeared with his forces, rapidly debouching into Kansas Avenue. With great rapidity and considerable military skill, he threw his men forward, and by rapid orders, shouted in a stern, shrill voice, formed his companies into the strongest form they could occupy for their service. On the one hand, the armed and uniformed dragoons with flashing sabers, on the other, only 2 Topeka companies, with their 2 banners. While the dragoons approached, the band was playing, but the drummers continued to drum until the drumsticks nearly touched the noses of the advancing horses of the dragoons. One little boy was beating the kettle drum, and rattled it manfully, never turning to look at the dragoons. The 2 pieces of artillery were planted about 100 yards up the street. They were said to be loaded with grape. The slow match was lighted." End quote. With a clash imminent between federal troops and Free State militia, everyone held their breath. But no one made an aggressive move, and Sumner walked into Constitution Hall to find no quorum for the legislature. Sam Walker tells us, quote, "The legislature was not there to hear the order. It was gone, all gone. And the orators, where were they? Ask of the cornfields and hazelbrush that for miles around concealed their quivering forms. The member who had been speaking when Sumner came up made his exit through a back window, jumping 15 feet to the ground, and through the dust of his exodus could dimly be seen in the far distance a flying coattail and a pair of heels, punishing the ground 45 strokes a second." End quote. And the next crisis was, for the moment, averted. John Brown rode out of Topeka in disgust, disappointed at the lost opportunity to kill federal troops. And for the time being, it looked like the pro-slavery party in Kansas had won. From Monahan, quote, "Sumner walked slowly to his horse, mounted, and led his battalion out of town. People hurrahed the solemn man who had done an unpleasant duty. Someone diverted the shouting to 3 cheers for Fremont and 3 groans for Pierce. The crowd responded, Free State Democrats shouting, without realizing it, for the new Republican Party. And this was exactly what was happening all through Kansas. Both President Pierce and Secretary of War Jefferson Davis denied ordering the dispersal of the Topeka legislature. They had only sanctioned the use of the army to disperse persons combining for insurrection, they maintained. However, Colonel Sumner was soon replaced, a graceful disciplinary gesture, but his command was given to Pulsifer F. Smith, a Pennsylvanian with known Southern sympathies. True, he was a virtual invalid, so dashing Jeb Stuart and other hot bloods were sure to put Free State settlers in their place. At last, everything had gone in favor of the slave power. The Free State leaders were all imprisoned or driven from the territory. The ports of entry were all blockaded, and the Topeka government had been officially dispersed. However, 2 things remained to be reckoned with. In the coming election, the entire nation would vote on the Kansas issue, and that man, Jim Lane, was back east, talking as he had never talked before. End quote. Whatever else he might have been, Jim Lane was most definitely a talker. He was one of the few Free State leaders who had successfully avoided capture and escaped the territory when the pro-slave government cracked down on the movement in the spring. And while the sacking of Lawrence, the Pottawatomie Massacre, Blackjack, and the Topeka legislature meeting were going on, he hadn't been idle. In his mind, Robinson's peaceful political solution had failed, and now he intended to take a more militant route. Now I want to talk about these seemingly different strategies for a minute. The approaches that Lane and Robinson had to this situation are often presented as opposed to each other. Robinson wanted to use nonviolent political means to win Kansas for the North. Lane was more militant. Now, it's certainly true to say that Robinson and Lane ended up strongly disliking each other personally, maybe even hating each other. But I don't think that actually implies what people think it does about how their respective strategies functioned in relation to each other. Robert Collins talks a lot about this in his biography of Lane. He goes over the debate that's been going on among historians of this period ever since over whether it was Robinson's strategy or Lane's that was primarily responsible for making Kansas a free state. And while Collins ultimately comes down on the side of Lane, he does present that debate in a pretty balanced way from what I can tell. The problem with this debate in the first place is the same problem that exists in American politics as a whole. It falls into a false dialectic. People come into this and see that Lane and Robinson disliked each other personally and had wildly different ideas about how to go about fighting for their cause. They assume that one of those approaches must have been right and the other wrong, and then they debate which one they think was right. And that debate ends up involving not just Lane and Robinson personally, but it becomes a larger dialectic between the 2 wings of the Free State movement, the New England wing that Robinson represents and the Northwestern wing that Lane represents. But here's the thing. I don't think these strategies are actually opposed to each other in the way this dialectic assumes. They're actually two sides of the same coin. Remember what Robinson's strategy actually was. He wasn't opposed to violent action in principle. You can see that from some of the things he said in his private letters to guys like Eli Thayer and Amos Lawrence. He presented himself publicly as a nonviolent moderate because he wanted the pro-slavery faction to be seen as the aggressors by wider public opinion in the North. Well, he certainly succeeded in that and maybe got more than he bargained for. But what's the point of having public opinion on your side in that way? Public opinion on its own doesn't actually do anything, unless there's some action attached to it. What was that action going to look like? Well, that's where Lane comes in. The action was always going to be military in nature. Robinson, with the support of the Immigrant Aid Society and the abolitionist media, had successfully painted the pro-slavery faction as the aggressors as far as public opinion in the North was concerned. Now Lane would harness that public opinion into action, first by using his oratorical skills to fire up Northerners even more than they already were, and second by organizing them to take effective military action. The Robinson strategy can't be effective without the Lane strategy. And on the flip side, the Lane strategy can't be effective without the Robinson strategy either. I mean, in America, you can't just immediately start enforcing your political will with militia forces. That is, not without justification. You need a story to justify and legitimize military action, and that's what the Robinson strategy provides. Once you can tell a story to the public in a way that makes Missourians the ruthless aggressors against innocent Kansas abolitionists, now you have justification for military action, which can then be portrayed as defensive in nature, when in reality, as we've seen, the abolitionist strategy in Kansas was absolutely offensive overall. So the point is, despite the personal beef that will develop between the two leaders, and regardless of what each may have thought about the other's approach, the two strategies are not opposed to each other at all. Quite the opposite, in fact. They actually can't be effective without each other. So now Robinson had done his work, and it was time for Lane to take over. During the spring and early summer of 1856, he was on a public speaking tour throughout the North to drum up support for the Kansas Free State cause. He made a speech at a rally in Chicago that was characteristic of how he would speak on this tour. Collins gives an excerpt from that speech in his book. Quote, "I have been sent by the people of Kansas to plead their cause before the people of the North. Most persons have a very erroneous idea of the people of Kansas. They think that they are mostly from Massachusetts. They are really more than 9/10 from the northwestern states. There are more men from Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana than from all New England and New York combined. The Missourians poured over the border in thousands, with bowie knives in their boots, their belts bristling with revolvers, their guns upon their shoulders, and 3 gallons of whiskey per vote in their wagons. When asked where they came from, their reply was, 'From Missouri.' When asked, 'What are you here for?' their reply was, 'Come to vote.' If anyone should go there and attempt to deny these things or apologize for them, the Missourians would spit upon him. They claim to own Kansas, to have a right to vote there and to make its laws, and to say what its institutions shall be. The legislature first passed acts virtually repealing the larger portion of the Constitution of the United States, and then repealed, as coolly as one would take a chew of tobacco, provisions of the Kansas-Nebraska bill. Of this bill I have a right to speak. God forgive me for so enormous and dreadful a political sin. I voted for the bill. I thought the people were to have the right to form their own institutions, and went to Kansas to organize the Democratic Party there, and make the state democratic, but the Missouri invaders poured in. The ballot boxes were desecrated. The bogus legislature was elected by armed mobs. You know the rest. The pro-slavery fragment of the Democratic Party also delights in the term nigger worshiper to designate free state men. I will show you that these pro-slavery men are, of all nigger worshippers, the most abject. According to the Kansas Code, if a person kidnapped a white child, the utmost penalty is 6 months in jail. If a nigger baby, the penalty is death. Who worships niggers, and slave nigger babies at that? To kidnap a white child into slavery, 6 months in jail. To kidnap a nigger into freedom, death. Is there an Illinoisan who says enforce these monstrous iniquities called laws? Show me the man. The people of Kansas never will obey them. They are being butchered, and one and all will die first. As for myself, I am going back to Kansas, where there is an indictment pending against me for high treason. Were the rope around my neck, I would say that as to the Kansas Code, it shall not be enforced. Never. Never. End quote. Lane wasn't just a powerful speaker, he was a smart politician too. He knew how to appeal to both wings of the Free State movement. That point he makes in the speech about punishment for kidnapping a white baby versus, quote, kidnapping a black baby into freedom is an argument aimed at motivating the moderate Western wing of the movement who were generally more concerned with how slavery affected themselves than with any ideological commitment to abolitionism. Lane had every intention of returning to Kansas just as soon as he finished his oratorical work and firing up the North. The obvious problem with that was the blockade of the Missouri River to Free State settlers was tighter now than it had ever been. He would have to bypass Missouri completely and take a route to Kansas through Iowa and Nebraska territory instead. But even in that apparent obstacle was opportunity, especially for a showman like Lane. See, Lane wouldn't go to Kansas alone. By this time, there was a national-level immigrant aid society known as the National Kansas Committee, and that committee planned to form its own militia to accompany Lane into the territory. Collins writes, quote, Lane probably also recognized that by avoiding Missouri, his movements would not be firmly known by the pro-slavery authorities. If the armed company promised by the National Kansas Committee did not materialize, or if it was smaller than he had hoped, he would still be able to use it to his advantage if it moved to Kansas undetected by Missouri authorities. Indeed, such a secret trail would further enhance his reputation as a leader to both his friends and his enemies. End quote. Rumor can be a powerful thing for morale. Lane started to publicize what he called the Lane Trail, a route from Chicago to Iowa City to Nebraska City and then south into Kansas Territory. Word of that was circulated in the North, not only to let Kansas Committee recruits know where to go to follow Lane, but also so that word would make its way into the territory ahead of the group. Collins says that, quote, Kansans were told, look for Captain Cook on a white horse, and everyone recognized that Cook would be Jim Lane. It was all amazing propaganda to cow the pro-slave bands. End quote. Lane eventually made his way to Nebraska City at the head of a group of around 600 Free State settlers, which by now was being called Lane's Army of the North. This was really more of a group of settlers than an army. There were plenty of families, including women and children, but that didn't much matter for propaganda purposes. And Lane was sometimes almost too much of a showman for his own good. He was hyping up his Army of the North as much as he possibly could. He styled himself a general and started handing out military titles to men in the company, on no legitimate authority to do that, by the way. He was so good at hyping up the army that he started to draw concern from leaders of the National Kansas Committee. It seems some of them thought that the idea of an invading army sweeping into Kansas from the north like some Mongol horde and driving their enemies before them was maybe going a little too far, even with the justification of Missourian aggression. Robinson, unsurprisingly, thought the same thing when he got word of the impending arrival of Lane's army while sitting in jail at Lecompton. He wrote a letter to Lane, who was then approaching Nebraska City. The man he chose to deliver it was Sam Walker, who had become a loyal friend to Lane in the months before he'd fled the territory, and Robinson was sure Lane would listen to him. Walker rode first to Topeka and then north when he happened across John Brown and his band. Brown, as it turned out, was eager to meet the grim chieftain and decided to accompany Walker to Nebraska. So they rode on. Monahan picks up the story here. Quote, They found Lane near Nebraska City in Dr. Blanchard's house, grim, disconsolate, almost in tears. He had just been requested by the National Kansas Committee to leave the Army. Walker handed him the letter from the Free State Conservatives, watched him read, and then sit with bowed head, tears glistening on his beard. Finally, Lane looked up and said, "Walker, if you say the people of Kansas don't want me, it's all right, and I'll blow my brains out. I can never go back to the States and look the people in the face and tell them that as soon as I had got these Kansas friends of mine fairly into danger, I had to abandon them. I can't do it. No matter what I say in my defense, no one will believe it. I'll blow my brains out and end the thing right here." Walker had come north to stop the invasion, not to see his hero commit suicide. "General," Walker told him, "the people of Kansas would rather have you than all the party at Nebraska City. I have 15 good boys that are my own. If you will put yourself under my orders, I'll take you through all right." Lane's eyes brightened. Dr. Blanchard disguised him for the ride, and Mrs. Blanchard brought some old clothes. Silver nitrate was sponged on Lane's grizzly beard to blacken it, all to no effect. Lane looked more like himself in the old clothes than he did in the new ones he had worn on Eastern lecture platforms. After dark, they set off. Walker, his men, and Old Brown's party, some 30 in all. The grim chieftain had not been deterred, even by Sam Walker. Instead, Walker, who had gone to stop him, became his stanchest supporter. End quote. I'll just make a quick note here. You might think that suicide threat was just a manipulation by a smart politician, and maybe it was, but I'm not so sure about that, for reasons we'll get to over the course of this series. For now, suffice it to say, that's not the last time Lane will threaten suicide, and it seems to me that he might have been more akin to King Saul than Brown was, especially later in the story as the conflict drags on. But for now, what happened next was an event that became something of a legend, in really kind of a strange way. For reasons that are somewhat unclear, Lane decided he wanted to get to Kansas yesterday. So he left his army in Nebraska City and set off immediately with Walker and Brown, intending to get into the territory absolutely as fast as possible. Walker picks up the account here. Quote, "He said we must get down there by the next night. The streams were full and no fords. Lawrence was 150 miles away. Our party now consisted of about 30 persons. Accordingly, we struck out for Lawrence, Lane leading. All that night he pushed on, halting a little just before morning to let the horses graze. The boys threw themselves upon the grass, and were soon fast asleep. Brown himself went some distance from the camp, sat down with his back to a tree and his rifle across his knees, and also went to sleep. When Lane got ready to go ahead, he directed me to go and awaken Brown. I found the old man asleep, and not thinking of danger, I put my hand on his shoulder. Quick as lightning, he was on his feet, with his rifle at my breast. I struck up the muzzle of his gun not a second too soon, as the charge passed over my shoulder, burning the cloth of my coat. Thereafter I never approached Brown when he was sleeping, as that seemed to be his most wakeful time." End quote. Lane set such a furious pace that the men couldn't keep up, and they dropped out one by one as the band crossed the prairie. Even Brown couldn't keep up, and by the time the group reached Topeka, only 6 of the original 30 were left. Walker continues, quote, "At about 10 o'clock that night, we reached the Kansas River, opposite Topeka, our party having been reduced to 6. We could not cross the river by ferry, as the ferrymen lived up in Topeka. The only chance left was to ford. My horse was the only one able to swim across with its rider. The others refused to swim, and one was mired in the quicksand. Lane and Charlie Stratton swam over. Going into town, we 3 got something to eat, the first we had since leaving Nebraska City. Lane and Stratton got fresh horses, and we started for Lawrence, though it was raining as hard as it could. Before I reached my home, I fell off my horse 3 times from the effects of hunger and fatigue. Each of the 3 times, Lane helped me to my saddle again. On reaching home, I could go no further. Stratton continued 2 miles before he gave up, and Lane went into Lawrence alone, reaching there at 3 o'clock in the morning, August 11th. End quote. And I'll let Collins wrap up the account. Quote, said Albert Richardson, who also wrote an account of the incident, after 3 or 4 hours' rest, Lane was attending to his ordinary business. In 30 hours, Jim Lane had ridden almost non-stop from Nebraska City to Lawrence via Topeka. The men riding with him, who were supposed to be protecting him, found they lacked the strength to keep up with him. Even John Brown failed to keep pace. It would be a story that Lane's friends would tell long after he had died, a reminder of the man's will and stamina. End quote. To put that in perspective, Nebraska City to Lawrence via Topeka is a distance of about 145 miles. It would take almost 2.5 hours to drive by car today. Lane did it on horseback in under 30 hours. And the strangest thing about it is, there doesn't seem to be really any good reason for him to have done that beyond the sheer legend of the story. It's not like he was on a forced march to relieve a besieged garrison somewhere. It seems like it wouldn't have made all that much of a difference if he arrived in Kansas a day or two later than he did. But nevertheless, he did it. He arrived back in Lawrence in the early morning hours of August 11th, 1856, and beyond just attending to his ordinary business, he was already leading military operations by the next day. Now, before we get into Lane's first military campaign in Kansas, I want to remind you again of the lack of actual military training and experience among the combatants here. That doesn't just translate to a lack of discipline or a lack of technical or tactical skills on the battlefield. It also translates to campaigns that are, let's say, strategically chaotic. The whole territory was chaos at this point, and that includes the operations of the various militia forces. So whenever a commander like Lane or anyone else makes an attack at a particular place or marches somewhere or really does anything at all, the actual military objectives behind these actions are always pretty dubious. Generally speaking, to understand any military engagement, you want to know not just what happened on the immediate battlefield, but also what led up to it. You know, the campaign, the movements of the armies, and especially what each side was trying to accomplish and why. You also want to know what the consequences of the fighting were, who accomplished their goal or failed to, what the casualties were and how they affected the future fighting capabilities of the armies, where each army went after breaking contact and why. All that helps you understand what the battle meant in the larger context of the war. The problem with this war in particular is that it's really hard to tell what anyone's military objectives were with any given battle or campaign, and often it seems more likely that the driving forces are individuals and personal grudges than anything of real military value. That being said, you can still kind of make sense of some of it militarily, and I'll try to do that whenever I can as we talk about these battles. Later in Missouri, as we get to 1861 and beyond, there will be more actual military strategy involved, but for now, things are pretty chaotic, so just keep that in mind. The way Monahan explains what happens next in Civil War on the Western Border is that Lawrence was under siege. Missourian and pro-slavery Kansan militias had established forts covering all the roads leading into Lawrence. The nearest was Fort Franklin, covering the California road leading into Lawrence from the southeast. The second was Fort Titus, covering the California road from the west. And the third was Fort Saunders, further south near the Santa Fe road. I call these forts. They're not really proper forts. I'll go over what they actually are as we go, but really they're convenient rallying points for pro-slavery militia to blockade the roads leading into Lawrence. They would ride out from these points and seize supply wagons so Lawrence couldn't be fed, and if this continued long enough, the citizens of the main Free State stronghold in the territory would be forced to either leave or starve. And of course, they're also just a thorn in the side of all the Free State settlers in the area. We've talked about a few specific incidents, but by this time in the territory, robbery and harassment of people in their homes was pretty common all over. Because pro-slavery Kansans reinforced by Missourians still outnumbered Free Staters pretty significantly, the pro-slavery militia was stronger and therefore did most of the robbing and harassment. But that was about to change because Lane's Army of the North was trickling in through the Nebraska border. The main port of entry for Free Staters on the Missouri border was Kansas City, where the Kansas River empties into the Missouri River, and as we've said, that route was pretty much closed at this point. Pro-slavery militia would also try to blockade the Nebraska border, but that was a much harder proposition. There's no physical boundary between Kansas and Nebraska like a river or a mountain range. The border is just a line on a map, and the landscape in the neighborhood of that line is just open prairie. There's also no major transportation highway leading to or across the border like the Missouri River does from the east. That means that to stop people from coming in that way, you just have to patrol the entire border, or at least the eastern part of it, and nobody has the manpower or resources to do that at this point, so people trickled in. Free state settlers already in the territory noticed that their people were coming in and started to get more bold. With that, plus the morale boost of having their militant figurehead Lane back in Lawrence, along with his legendary ride from Nebraska City, the Lawrence militia went over to the offensive. They chose Franklin as their first target, which made sense as the closest pro-slavery outpost to Lawrence. Besides that, there was an artillery piece rumored to be there, the same one used to bombard the Free State Hotel in May. The Free Staters hoped to drive the pro-slavery militia out of Franklin and capture the cannon, which they could then use to help them in assaults on the other pro-slavery forts. Fort Franklin was really just a log building in the village being used as a hotel and post office. Around 11 p.m. on the night of August 12th, the day after Lane arrived in Lawrence, 80 Free State militiamen marched out and surrounded the town. The pro-slave militia was not prepared for this. Goodrich says there were only 14 of them in the town that night, and at the approach of this overwhelming force, they holed up in the hotel and post office, the most defensible building in town. One of them said later, quote, "They sent one of their men up to demand our arms. Our captain replied that he would not give them up, and called to his men, and they all said they would die before the abolitionists should have them. The abolitionists then surrounded the house and commenced to fire upon it, which our men returned." End quote. The shooting went on for a few hours without really accomplishing much. Untrained men shooting at each other in the dark at fairly long ranges isn't bound to do much damage to either side, especially when one side is holed up in a log building shooting from the windows, although Goodrich says there was one Free Stater killed and a few wounded on each side. Thomas Bickerton was the man who hoped to take command of the Free State militia's artillery whenever they could get their hands on a cannon. He gives his account of how the siege of Fort Franklin ended. Quote, "Finally, I got tired of lying there, especially as I had nothing but a pistol, so I went over to Joseph Cracklin behind the stable and told him something must be done, as it was useless to waste ammunition any longer. I proposed getting some hay and setting fire to them. Caleb and Fuller volunteered to go with me, each with a bundle of hay. So we went around to the end of the hotel, on the road, thinking there were no windows there where they could see us. But just as we got within reach of their guns, they began to fire on us. I found an empty wagon, which we loaded up with dry hay. Minister Fuller, a brave little man, volunteered to take hold one side of the tongue of the wagon, while I took the other side, giving him these directions. 'Now, Fuller, if I am shot down, kick me out of the way and go on with the wagon. And if you are shot, I will serve you the same way.' Several others volunteered to push it from behind. Just as we landed on the front doorsteps, down came a volley from the chamber, just over our heads, throwing the dirt into our faces and eyes. We then went around behind the wagon, and found 2 of our men still there, one of whom had a wisp of hay already lighted, from which we set the load on fire on all sides." End quote. I mean, this whole fight is straight out of a Western movie, right? You got your guys holed up in a cabin which is surrounded, the 2 sides shoot at each other for a while to no effect, and then somebody sets a hay wagon on fire to smoke them out. Well, when the burning wagon threatened to set the building on fire, the pro-slavery defenders decided they'd had enough. The ones who could fled the building, and the ones too badly wounded to run yelled for quarter. Bickerton continues, quote, "We entered the front door just in time to see our opponents leaving by the back one. We immediately drew away the wagon from the house and turned it over, and saved both it and the house from destruction. Over the floor of the house were strewn United States muskets in profusion, while in one corner of the room we found the object of our search." End quote. The object of their search was, of course, the cannon. The Free Staters looted the town, made prisoners of the defenders who failed to escape, and marched back to Lawrence with their prize. It's disputed whether or not Lane was present at the siege of Fort Franklin. Goodrich says he was, Monahan says he might have been, but probably not. Collins also says he was there. Either way, if Lane was there, he didn't take much of an active part in the fighting. He did make a very big deal out of the victory, though. Citizens of Lawrence were elated. Bickerton, the artillery commander who now had a cannon but no ammo for it, looked to the Herald of Freedom newspaper office. It turned out some of the newspaper type had been recovered from the river where the Missourians had tossed it during the sack of Lawrence. The editor, George Washington Brown, was in jail at Lecompton, and so Bickerton had that type melted down and made into artillery ammunition. The next target for the Free State Militia was Fort Saunders, further south on Washington Creek near the Santa Fe Road across the Wakarusa. Fort Saunders was actually the log home of a pro-slavery settler named James Saunders, but it seems like more of a legitimate fort than the hotel at Franklin. I don't know if Saunders actually built it with a siege in mind, but it's possible he did. Monahan says it was, quote, 25 feet square and 2 stories high, with rows of loopholes on both levels. 100 men in this blockhouse might stand off 1,000. End quote. A major of the Free State Militia named David Hoyt volunteered to go to Fort Saunders and find out the strength of its defenders. Monahan says his friends tried to talk him out of this, thinking he'd just be killed, but that Hoyt was a Freemason and thought he'd be protected by fellow Freemasons in the pro-slavery camp. If Hoyt was a Mason, it didn't help him, and he was shot dead on his approach to Fort Saunders. It seemed like the strength of the fort was about to be tested. 45 pro-slavery men holed up there and fortified the place with earthworks surrounding the building. More Free State men were showing up in Lawrence every day, and now emboldened by their growing numbers as well as Lane's presence and their new artillery piece, the army that marched out to take Fort Saunders was 500 strong. This time, Lane was definitely with them, as were John Brown and his guerrilla band. As the army approached, scouts reported that the fort was indeed as strong as rumored. Fearing the heavy casualties that would result from an assault, Lane came up with another idea. Sam Walker reports, quote, collecting all the wagons he could get, he had poles cut about as long as a man, and then tied hay to one end of them. Placing them in the wagons, it produced the impression that they were filled with men. When we climbed the hills inside of the fort, we made a big show in front with our mounted men behind the wagons, and, still further behind, the men on foot. At a distance, it looked like an army of 1,200 men. We could see the enemy standing on top of their blockhouse, looking at us. And then Goodrich continues. The column, as it appeared to us, admitted an awestruck defender, extended for a mile in length, marching 10 abreast. When he felt the enemy had been sufficiently impressed, Lane finally deployed his men and prepared to charge. Before a shot was fired, John Laurie later wrote, we received the order, double quick, forward march. And the way we put into it was a caution. We scaled their stockade, rushed across their embanked breastwork, and entered the fort in less time than I have been writing. Captain Brown with his men was among the first to reach the fort, noted one of those racing forward. To Brown's surprise, however, he found the works empty and the cabin cleared. Prudently, the Southerners had fled for their lives at the first rush. We followed on in the wake of the retreating ruffians, recalled John Laurie, charged through 2 deep ravines and made the discovery that the enemy knew the country better than we did. End quote. The Free State Army took possession of the cabin and other buildings and looted them of guns, powder, bullets, and food before torching them. And then Lane oddly disappeared. Walker continues, quote, in the evening, Lane called us all together and turned the command over to me, and without another word of explanation or advice of any kind, he turned, put spurs to his horse, and galloped away toward Topeka, followed by 15 men. That was the last we saw or heard of him for a long time. Lane never gave any reason for his strange conduct. And then Goodrich says, some, dismayed by his poor showing at Franklin and Washington Creek, were not sad to see Lane and his bogus military reputation go. Lane dressed in men's clothes, but he's far from being one. spit a contemptuous free soiler. All the same, and as Sam Walker and perceptive others agreed, Lane's ability to fire men into action was worth a regiment. End quote. The fall of Fort Saunders left Fort Titus as the last pro-slavery outpost guarding the roads into Lawrence. And here's where that military strategy versus personal grudge idea comes in. See, Fort Titus was actually the home of Henry Titus, another pro-slavery man. And while it's true his home did sit near the California road's western approach to Lawrence, and taking it out would allow supplies to flow into the town from that direction more effectively, it's questionable whether Walker or anyone else was actually thinking strategically in that way. Because besides the military value of the fort, Walker had a personal grudge against Titus himself. From Goodrich, quote, "When the white-eyed survivors of Washington Creek reached his spacious log cabin 1 mile south of the capital, Lecompton, Henry Titus knew what was coming. Since his advent in Kansas, the handsome, swashbuckling Floridian had become a symbol of Southern resolve in the Lecompton area. As a consequence, Titus had also become one of the most loved and hated men in the territory. Described by the New York Tribune as a two-legged specimen of savage tigerhood, the big, burly slaver was one of the more conspicuous leaders during the sack of Lawrence. Henry Titus was also, personally as well as politically, a bitter foe of his neighbor Sam Walker. Regarding the fiery Free Stater as little better than a robber, incendiary, and horse thief, Titus offered $500 to the man who would bring in Walker's head, on or off his shoulders. And thus, when the huge Southerner heard the news from Franklin and Washington Creek, he knew his wait would not be long. On the same day as the Saunders affair, Titus led a patrol down the California road in an effort to locate Walker and his army. Later that evening, the two parties collided not far from Walker's home. The fight was short but sharp, and when Titus fled pell-mell, he left one man dead and one captured. Rather than pursue in the dark, Walker wisely went into camp on his claim. Henry Titus's hatred of Samuel Walker was reciprocated fourfold. The latter's loathing of slavery and anyone associated with it ran deep long before he and his family were kicked off the steamer by hooting Missourians in March 1855. After that event, however, and the humiliating trek to the territory, Sam Walker's fight for a free Kansas became fanatical. Originally intent on attacking Lecompton first, then doubling back to deal with Titus, Walker changed course when contacts inside the U.S. Army camp 3 miles southwest of the capital, the same camp in which Free State prisoners were held, warned that the military would fight for the town. Henry Titus was another matter. With many officers, including Camp Commander Major John Sedgwick, in collusion with the Free Soilers, Walker was promised a free hand. In a conversation with the Major some time before, revealed Walker, he stated that if we could attack and capture Titus before the governor sent orders to him, that he would not interfere, but that if he got the orders, he would be compelled to stop us. End quote. Well, Fort Titus promised to be a tougher nut to crack for Walker than Fort Saunders, because unlike the defenders of Fort Saunders, Henry Titus wasn't about to give up his home without a fight. Walker continues, quote, "All that night I slept but little. Daylight began to break when the stage from Lecompton to Kansas City drove up to the door of my cabin. The driver called me to one side and asked whether I wanted to take Titus, that if I did, now was the time. He said that in the skirmish of the night before, Titus's men had become scattered, and that the greater part of them were in Lecompton, thinking that we were coming there. Mounting my horse, I went to the camp and ordered every man that had a horse to follow me, the rest to stay and cook breakfast and follow us." End quote. Speed was of the essence if Walker hoped to take Titus before the governor could get word to the U.S. troops at Lecompton and order them to intervene. Besides taking the fort fast, the other thing Walker could do to make sure there was no intervention was to make sure that the governor wouldn't find out about the attack until after it was over. To that end, the first thing he did was divide his force of 50 men, sending 10 to keep an eye on Lecompton while the other 40 went to the Titus claim. He found 20 to 30 Titus men camped in a grove next to the log house. Goodrich continues, quote, "I counted my men and found there were just 50, Walker recalled. I then divided them into 3 squads. I gave 10 men to Captain Joel Grover, with instructions to get between Titus's Lecompton troops and those of the United States, and allow no messenger to go to the camp. I gave 10 men to Captain Henry Chambry, with instructions to place his men along a fence that ran in front of Titus's house, and about 200 yards from it. With the balance of his force, Walker ordered a charge, and went roaring down on the camp. Except for one man who was shot and killed, the startled Southerners raced from their tents into the cabin. The moment that we charged the camp, Titus was standing in his door, Walker said, and he called to his men to come into the house. Chambry, seeing the move, mounted his men and dashed up to the door of the house. There were a number of men already in the house taking aim through portholes. When Chambry had advanced to within 6 feet of them, they fired, and wounded every man but one. Shot through the stomach, Henry Chambry was one of the first hit. He fell forward but stayed on his horse, remembered Luke Parsons. I went to him and led his horse behind the stable and helped him off and set him up against the stable. A steady fire was opened on us from the blockhouse, noted the hard-pressed Walker, who suddenly found his force pinned down. We sheltered ourselves as best we could behind trees, fences, and outhouses, and returned the fire, but in a short time we had 18 out of the 40 now comprising the attacking party wounded. After assisting the mortally wounded Chambry, Luke Parsons rejoined the fight from the cover of a small tree. Now quoting Parsons, "We had to watch for their smoke and then try to work a bullet in between the logs. While behind the tree, a man came to the upstairs gable window, struck it with his gun, and knocked out all the glass and most of the sash. He stuck his gun out and fired at me. At the same time, I was trying to get my gun in line with him. But he was in too much of a hurry to get good aim. He then stepped away, but another man immediately took his place and leveled his gun on me. I immediately recognized him as Colonel Titus, and as I had good aim on that very spot before he came, I shot first. He dropped his gun, threw up his hands, and fell over backward. I then ran to the shed and stood looking over the top of the spring wagon, and fired where I saw smoke come out of the cracks of the logs. Here I caught a bullet in my shin. It was a small ball, or it would have broken my leg. I went behind the stable and pulled off my boot to see how badly I was hurt. The bullet had flattened out on the bone as large as a dime. I had just got straightened up when Captain Walker came up and said, 'Parsons, why don't you shoot?' I said, 'I don't see anything to shoot at.' He jumped off his horse and squatted down behind the buggy and began to fire his revolver. I could not see a thing to shoot at except the logs. Finally, he laid down his pistol and said, 'Hand me your gun if you are afraid to shoot.' I gave him my gun. He fired and handed it back. I put in another charge and handed it to him." Now from Walker. "Just as I got the rifle to my shoulder, a musket was stuck out of a hole. Both guns were discharged at once. I do not know what effect my shot had, but I received 3 buckshot in my breast, and a man behind me got 11. The shock was hard enough to knock us both down, but the wounds were not dangerous. The men jumped and picked me up. Then springing up, they poured such a hot fire into that hole that there was no more firing out of it." Back to Goodrich. In danger of being overwhelmed himself, Walker sent a rider racing back to the main column, ordering the artillery and infantry forward at full speed. Thomas Bickerton recalled, now quoting Bickerton, "When we were about one halfway there to Titus's, we saw a horseman riding toward us in great haste, saying to us that our men were fighting like devils, and many of them were wounded. We then hurried up as fast as we could, and soon came in sight of Titus's house. I took my position on the side of the hill overlooking the house. My men soon partook of the excitement around them, when I ordered them to stop and get cool, and work the gun as though they were in Lawrence drilling in the presence of the ladies. After getting the gun loaded, I gave the men these instructions. 'Now, men, if you fire too high, you cannot see where the ball strikes, but if you fire low, you can see it strike, and aim her right next time.' Then I took a pretty low aim, and took my position at one side, so as to be clear of the smoke. Then I gave the order to 'Let her off easy, men.' Bang goes the gun, and I clapped my hands and said, 'Good.' The shot strikes the ground just this side of the house and bounds up to the 3rd log, thundering through it and on beyond, cutting the limbs from the trees a half-mile back of the house." End quote. If Lecompton hadn't already known what was happening, they sure found out as soon as the cannon started firing. But Major Sedgwick kept his promise to Walker not to intervene. With cannonballs passing clean through the house, Shattering logs and showering the inside with splinters, the defenders couldn't hope to hold out for long. But they kept on firing back until someone got the idea to repeat the burning hay wagon trick from Fort Franklin, and then the defenders raised the white flag. Walker describes the scene as the severely wounded Titus came out of his cabin with his men. Quote, Titus was all covered with blood, having received several severe wounds. The moment he was seen, 100 rifles were leveled at his head, and he shook like a leaf. Seeing me on his horse, he cried, "For God's sake, Walker, save my life. You have a wife and children. So have I. Think of them and save me." He was a pitiable object, and his appeal touched me. I took Titus into the stable. The men were intent on his life, and I had to knock one fellow down to keep him from shooting the poor wretch on the spot. End quote. The house was looted and torched, and Titus and his men were taken into Lawrence and paraded as prisoners in front of the same crowd that had watched them sack the town in May. Governor Shannon and Major Sedgwick came into town shortly after and organized a prisoner exchange, Titus and his men for several of the Free Staters being held at Lecompton, including Jason Brown and John Jr. That exchange didn't include Robinson, though. He stayed in jail. But it seems that after seeing firsthand the gathering of Free State militia forces in Lawrence, Shannon finally figured out that he wasn't cut out for this job. From Lecompton, he wrote to Major General Percifer Smith at Fort Leavenworth, quote, "We are threatened with utter extermination. I have just returned from Lawrence. I saw in that place at least 800 men who manifested a fixed purpose to demolish this town. I know that they intend an attack. There can concentrate at this place in a very short time some 1,500 or 2,000 men, well armed with several pieces of artillery. It would seem that the business of wiping out, as it is called, of the pro-slavery party has been commenced. The women and children have been mostly sent across the river, and there is a general panic among the people. The force here is small, say 80 or 100 dragoons, with some 120 citizens poorly armed and badly supplied with ammunition." Then Goodrich continues, "The following day, Shannon submitted his resignation. I am unwilling to perform the duties of governor of this territory any longer," he informed President Pierce. "Govern Kansas," the Ohioan later snorted. "You might as well attempt to govern the devil in hell." End quote. Regardless of whether anyone had been thinking strategically or not, the board in the neighborhood of Lawrence was now cleared of pro-slave strongholds, except for Lecompton itself. All that had happened over the course of less than a week. Lane rode back into Lawrence on August 11th, Franklin was taken on the night of August 12th to 13th, Saunders on the 15th, Titus on the 16th, and the prisoners were exchanged and Shannon's resignation submitted on the 17th. Which is to say that there hadn't been much time yet for a proper Missourian response. But we know by now how these things go, right? The Missouri militia had already marched across the border in force twice, over less serious things than all this fighting, and of course they were about to do it again. The pro-slavery press might not have been as successful as the abolitionist press in shaping national public opinion, but that doesn't mean it was any less apt for sensationalizing events in Kansas. On the latest outbreak of open war around Lawrence, headlines read thusly, from the Platte City Argus, quote, "Important from Kansas, civil war and rebellion, women and children flying from their homes for their lives, unprovoked, inhuman, and unparalleled attack." End quote. From the Leavenworth Herald, quote, "Rebellion, violence, murder, house burning, bloodshed, destroying settlements, destroying crops, murdering our citizens." End quote. And the Leavenworth Journal, quote, "Extra, war, 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 the bloody issue begun, let slip the dogs of war." End quote. As the press cranked up the temperature even more, Missourians and pro-slavery Kansans assembled at places like Lexington, Westport, Leavenworth, and Atchison, and prepared for the next invasion. Some men were too eager for violence to wait for the invasion, though. Goodrich tells of one particularly brutal incident. Quote, "War to the knife and knife to the hilt," cried the rough and ready squatter sovereign. "Let the watchword be extermination, total and complete." At least one border ruffian welcomed these words at their literal worst. As he sat drinking with friends in Leavenworth, in a rage over recent events, Charles Fugit bet $5 against a pair of boots that within 2 hours he would lift the hair of an abolitionist. Encountering a Free Stater a few miles from town, Fugit promptly shot the man dead, claimed his trophy, then flapped the scalp around among comrades boastingly during the night. "I went out for the scalp of a damned abolitionist," Fugit yelled, "and I have got one." End quote. Meanwhile, Walker, Lane, Brown, and other Free Staters were making the most of the time before the Missouri militia showed up to help their Kansas comrades. They and their guerrilla bands scoured the countryside, looting, pillaging, burning homes and crops, and driving out pro-slavery settlers as far south as Burlington and Garnett. Brown's band surprised a border ruffian band in camp along Middle Creek near Pottawatomie on August 26th. Samuel Anderson, one of Brown's men, described the attack this way, quote, "Before I had my men fairly stationed, the firing commenced. After a few discharges, the enemy were heard with heavy tramp like distant thunder rushing through the timber toward where my men were stationed. When they had reached within about 50 yards of us, we cried loudly for them to halt and surrender. Some turned to the right and others to the left, while 14 in number of footmen came forward and surrendered. Many of the horsemen dismounted and left their horses, and passed through the brush on foot and escaped. As they refused to halt, I ordered my men to fire. The effect produced by this fire wounded 2 men. End quote. That Missourian band scattered, leaving several wounded on the field, at least one mortally wounded. By the end of August, the Missouri militia was ready to march, again with 1,500 men under David Atchison, just like last November in the Wakarusa War. This time they came across the border at Little Santa Fe, just south of Kansas City and Westport. Just like the Northern militia, it's hard to say what their actual military objectives were since organization was at a minimum and there seems to have been little actual campaign planning. But what is known is that the column eventually split into 3 columns. Atchison continued west with his main force to sweep southern Douglas County of Free State settlers, burning homes and crops, looting settlements. We know the drill by now. He sent his lieutenant, John Reed, south toward Pottawatomie with probably around 400 to 500 men. Reed would make Pottawatomie itself his main objective, but first he sent his own detachment to split off again to the cabin of an abolitionist Indian named John Tecumseh Jones, known locally as Ottawa Jones because he lived on Ottawa Creek. Jones and his wife were staunch supporters and admirers of John Brown, and for that they'd earned the hatred of the Missourians. We're not told how many men Reed sent on this detachment, but it was enough. Jason Brown, who was there in Jones' cabin that night, gives the account. Quote, "A little after midnight, Jones heard a great noise among his dogs and sprang out of bed. As he did so, he heard the scabbards of the Missourians strike on the flagstones in front of his house as they dismounted from their horses. They had let down his cornfield fences and ridden on all sides, hoping to find a force of Free State men there in his double log house. But there was nobody in it except Jones and his wife, an Indian boy, and a neutral named Parker from Missouri. The ruffians shouted, 'We've got you now! Come out! Come out!' Nobody replying and fearing an ambush, they cried, 'Fire the house!' and began to do so, setting it on fire in several places. Jones had seized his gun and stood in the front hall thinking what he should do. 'I knew we must shoot,' he told me. 'We must fight or make our escape as best we could.' He opened the door and cocked his gun. The enemy, hearing it, called out, 'Don't shoot!' Whereupon he sprang out in his nightclothes and ran as far as he could into a 30-acre cornfield close by, the enemy shooting at him but missing. Mrs. Jones, in the meantime, had put about $400 in gold and silver into a bag and tried to conceal it and herself in the house. The captain of the ruffians, looking through the door, saw her and said, 'Come out, we won't hurt you.' As she went out, she dropped the money in the grass, and it was picked up by some of the band. They found Parker in bed. As they approached him with their weapons, he said, "Don't kill me, I'm sick." "We always find a good many sick men when we come round," was the reply. And with that, they dragged him out into the road, knocked him in the head, and cut his throat, but did not sever the jugular vein. Then dragged him to the bank of the Ottawa and threw him in among some brush. End quote. Jason escaped the cabin with Jones that night and ran to Pottawatomie to try to give his father some warning of the approach of Reed's Missourians. The band that attacked Jones' cabin moved northwest from Ottawa Creek, shot up Prairie City, and ultimately rejoined Atchison's main force. Meanwhile, the rest of Reed's force approached Pottawatomie on August 30th. Estimates of his strength range anywhere from 250 to 400 men. Jason would not get there in time to warn Old Brown, and more importantly, his brother Frederick. A pro-slavery preacher, Martin White, was leading Reed's force down the road toward Pottawatomie from the west, and as he approached the outskirts, coming toward him, walking out of town to go visit a neighbor, was none other than the least mentally stable of the Brown sons. White didn't give him a chance to do anything crazy. As soon as he recognized him as Frederick Brown, he raised his rifle and shot him in the chest, killing him on the spot. Frederick was 25 years old, the first of the Brown clan to die for the cause. John Brown was in Pottawatomie with just 15 of his men, totally unprepared to meet the hundreds now bearing down on the town. Word made its way to him pretty quick of what was happening. Luke Parsons, who was with him that day, tells it this way, quote, "While we were cooking breakfast, a man dashed into camp saying the border ruffians were coming from the west and had just killed Fred Brown. Brown started right off and said, 'Men, come on.' I started with him, and it was some minutes before any overtook us. While we were hurrying on by ourselves, Brown said, 'Parsons, were you ever under fire?' I replied, 'No, but I will obey orders. Tell me what you want me to do.' He said, 'Take more care to end life well than to live long.' When we reached the blockhouse in the village, he motioned to several to go in, myself with the rest. He then said to me, 'Hold your position as long as possible, and hurt them all you can, while we will go into the timber and annoy them from that side.' I fastened the door with a large bar. There was a second floor in the blockhouse, and part of the boys had gone up there." End quote. I'm not sure why Parsons says there that he's never been under fire. I just read an account of his from Fort Titus a little while ago where he was definitely under fire. But anyway, Old Man Brown found a group of about 30 Pottawatomie citizens already in the woods when he got there and took charge. Between those men and his own, the defenders of the town numbered no more than 50. Reed formed his men into two ranks and advanced through the woods where Brown and his men were dug in. As they came into rifle range, they halted and started firing, and Reed's one artillery piece opened up on the woods with grape shot. Parsons and his boys in the blockhouse heard the sounds of firing and apparently decided they'd be better off out in the open where they could maneuver. Parsons continues, quote, "Someone on the second floor called out, 'They have cannon and will blow us all to pieces in here. I am going to get out of this.' I said, 'No, you must stay.' Old Man Austin said, 'Stay here and let them blow us to hell and back again.' I went upstairs to get a better view of the enemy, and before I knew it, the door was opened and most of the men gone. We then went up to the Merdazine River in the timber and joined Brown at the fight." End quote. The shooting went on for an hour, with Brown and his men firing from the woods while trying to dodge the grape shot, and Reed's Missourians advancing steadily toward them. Parsons would say of Brown during the fight, quote, "He showed no fear whatever. Brown kept walking back and forth along the line, speaking to each man as he came to him, assuring him that all was going well. He would say, 'Keep cool, take good aim low, be sure to see both sides of your gun.' He came to me and said, 'Do you see anything on my back? Any blood? Are my clothes torn? Something hit me an awful rap on that shoulder.' Upon being told that I saw nothing, he said, 'Well, I declare, I don't intend to be shot in the back if I can help it.'" End quote. As determined as Brown was, and apparently as cool under fire as he was, the Free Staters couldn't hope to stand up against the sheer numbers of Missourians for long, outnumbered somewhere between 5-1 and 8-1. Brown and his men eventually scattered, leaving the way clear for the Missourians to advance on the town of Pottawatomie. Brown's half-sister Florella was hiding in a cabin with some other women and children, and she later wrote about the approach of the Missourians. Quote, 15 or 20 came dashing down to our house and up to the door, yelling out, "Who lives here, and where is the man?" A sick woman and 3 little children, having fled to us for protection, commenced screaming and crying, "Don't kill us! Don't burn the house down over us!" While I stood in the door and begged they would spare our lives, and they might have all they could find in the house or on the place. Seeing us frightened almost to death, the captain said, "Hold on, boys, there is nobody here but women and children, and we are gentlemen. We never abuse women and children. Don't be frightened, ladies, we won't hurt you. But if we get the men, we will put the rope over their heads mighty quick." End quote. As was the usual practice in the territory by now, the Missourians looted the town of everything of value they could carry, and then set the whole town on fire, burning every building except for 3 cabins where the women and children were hiding. The final death toll was 5 on the Free State side, including Frederick Brown, and none on the Missouri side. As the Missourians marched back the way they'd come, the wheels were already turning in Brown's mind. As he looked out over the burning wreckage of Pottawatomie, he reportedly said to his son Jason, quote, "God sees it. I have only a short time to live, only one death to die, and I will die fighting for this cause. There will be no more peace in this land until slavery is done for. I will give them something else to do than extend slave territory. I will carry this war into Africa." End quote. Jason Brown would have known that Africa was his father's term for the South as a whole. I don't know what exactly was going through Brown's mind at that moment as he watched Pottawatomie burn, but a guy might be pretty discouraged after suffering a defeat like this one. And for Brown, his mind might have naturally gone back to the scheme he'd hatched years ago and discussed with Frederick Douglass at his North Elba home back in the winter of 1847-48. 5 weeks after the Battle of Pottawatomie, Brown's first trip to Kansas Territory would be over. He left the territory in October in the back of a wagon, sick with dysentery, just as broke as he'd been when he came, but he had one new and valuable thing: a reputation. The publicity campaign of James Redpath and other northern newspaper men had worked wonders, and already made Pottawatomie Brown into a hero of the abolitionist movement. He would make great use of that reputation over the next few years. We'll get to what exactly he did with it later, but for now, the ball was already rolling in Kansas, and would continue to roll with or without Brown. I want to go back to that quote from Brown's half-sister Florella for a minute. Florella quotes a Missourian captain as having said that he and his men were gentlemen and would never abuse women and children. And the crazy thing is, that's pretty much true for the most part, and it's true for both sides. For as much robbing and burning and killing as was going on at this time, women and children were not directly harmed for the most part. That's in stark contrast to some of the rumors and newspaper headlines flying around. We've talked about those before, and if they were to be believed, things were over-the-top barbaric. Charles Robinson's wife Sarah was writing in her diaries and letters about the torture and abuse of Free State women by border ruffians. There was one report of a border ruffian cutting out the heart of an abolitionist and eating it. Julia Lovejoy wrote hysterically in letters back home of the wanton rape of Free State women and the killing of any children over 6 months of age by Missourians. As bad as things were, none of that was really even close to true. I actually find it kind of amazing how rarely women and children were directly harmed by either side during this time. The first reason you might think of for that is the optics of it. I mean, everybody involved here would have understood the sensibilities of the nation as a whole, and also understood that it wouldn't go well for them in the press if they were seen to be crossing that line. But that doesn't really work as an explanation because, as we've already seen, Newspapers and hysterical letter writers were going to report plenty of abuse of women and children, whether it was actually happening or not. I think the better explanation for that has to do with the shared religious roots of the nation, namely Protestant Christianity. For as much as I railed against Protestantism in Part 1, and for as far removed as it is from Orthodoxy, the nation isn't so far gone at this point that it's lost all semblance of societal values. There are plenty of wars you can look at throughout history where there was nowhere near this level of deference shown towards women and children, or really any semblance of civility at all. So I have to give that much to Protestantism. Although I think it helped cause this war, it also contributes to the war maybe not being as bad as it could have been through a strong collective aversion to certain things like harming non-combatants, especially women and children. That aversion is what makes things like the Pottawatomie Massacre so egregious to the people in the society. But the thing about social norms is they're not static. They can change. And when we talk about the escalation of violence from peacetime to full-scale guerrilla war, part of what we're talking about is the gradual breakdown of those social norms. Events like the Pottawatomie Massacre contribute to that breakdown. Responses to those events also contribute, maybe even more so than the events themselves. When you have Northerners either downplaying the severity of John Brown's crime or just straight up approving of them like James Redpath, what they're really saying is, we no longer care about the norm that says you don't murder people in their homes. As long as it's our guy doing it and it serves our purposes, it's an ethically neutral thing, or maybe even a positive good. And don't think for a second that people on the other side don't notice that the norms are being broken down. This is how the situation becomes just a friend-enemy distinction kind of thing. Anything our guys do is good, anything their guys do is bad. Another way the norms are broken down is when they're used as tools in the conflict. To see what I mean by that, look at those false rumors I talked about a minute ago. Why would someone start or spread a false rumor about their enemy eating someone's heart or about their enemy abusing women and killing children? They do it to make their enemy look bad for political reasons, to further their own side's goals in the conflict. And the reason it makes their enemy look bad is because the society collectively has an aversion to barbaric acts like those. I mean, if the whole society was just totally fine with cannibalism, a story about your enemy committing an act of cannibalism wouldn't really make them look bad, would it? So the effectiveness of these false rumors in making the enemy look bad and firing up your friends depends on those norms being in place. The norms are being used as propaganda tools. People notice this stuff. I only gave Free State examples of it a minute ago, but it wasn't just them doing it, it was both sides. Although I do think the North was better at playing that game than the South. But people notice when their political enemy is using their deeply held societal values as propaganda tools. If I'm on either side of the conflict and I see the enemy freaking out about my side's violations of norms, or even making up false stories about such violations, and then turning around and committing the same kinds of violations themselves, it becomes pretty obvious pretty quick that the enemy doesn't really care all that much about the norms anymore. Then I might start to think if my side wants to find a way to win the conflict, maybe we should take the gloves off and stop respecting the norms too. I started off this section talking about the rarity of direct violence towards women and children in the conflict thus far. But rare doesn't mean non-existent. And sometimes the rarity of horrific acts can make the instances that do happen stand out all the more. One of those instances occurred in the weeks after the Battle of Pottawatomie, while John Brown and his associates were roving through the region finding pro-slavery settlers to take vengeance on. Goodrich says this incident went mostly unreported at the time, so I think it also serves as an example of the South's inferiority at playing the propaganda game. There was a member of the Brown gang named John Cook. Remember that name, because he'll come up again later. Cook led a detachment on a raiding expedition to the southwest along the Neosho River. Brown was not with this group. Goodrich picks up the story. Quote, near Emporia, the gang stopped late one night at the cabin of Christian Carver. While the men beat and kicked at the door, Carver and his pregnant wife, 17-year-old Sarah, huddled in terror. Sarah's brother described what happened. Now quoting Sarah's brother. Sarah had raised up and was sitting on the bed close by an opening between the logs, used as a window. A man outside poked a gun through this opening, nearly against her, and fired. She cried out at once, "I am shot! I am killed!" With loud profanity, several men crowded into the house, boasting, "We are Jim Lane's front guard. We are the boys." One man dipped his hand into a pan of honey that sat on the table and exclaimed, "Boys, here is some honey. Let's eat it." At this instant, one raised a gun at Carver and said, "Damn him and his honey too." But another stopped him and said, "Let him alone now. We will be back in 3 days, and if he is not out of the territory then, we will hang him." And back to Goodrich. Her unborn child already dead, the young mother succumbed several days later. End quote. Now you might have noticed the reference to Jim Lane there. That's going to require some explanation. John Cook was a John Brown associate. He would end up taking part in Brown's Harper's Ferry raid in 1859. But if this account of Sarah Carver's brother is to be believed, he, or at least some of his men, had association with Jim Lane as well. It's unclear who the men were, or even how many there were in the group that raided the Carver home, but it seems like a fair bet that some or all of them had come to the territory as part of Lane's Army of the North, the wave of settlers that started flowing into Kansas through Nebraska territory in the summer of 1856. Many of those settlers were of a new breed that hadn't really been seen before in the territory. It's worth thinking for a minute about where we are in the conflict at this point. Most of the open violence and larger battles of the Bleeding Kansas period really took off in the summer of 1856, but war had been brewing for quite some time by then. By the time Lane made his ride from Nebraska City to Lawrence had already been sacked by the Missouri militia. Brown and his boys had already killed 5 people on the Pottawatomie and then defeated and captured Henry Clay Pate and his posse at Blackjack, and looting was already rife throughout the territory. All of that to say, things were heating up. There's violence, there's instability, there's the prospect of more violence to come. And the thing is, when you have a situation like this, it can tend to attract a certain kind of people. The kind of people I'm talking about is the kind who are maybe not all that ideologically committed like the original Immigrant Aid Society settlers, but are maybe just attracted to the violence for one reason or another. There could be a few different reasons people are attracted to chaotic situations like this. They could be energetic, young, military-aged men just looking for adventure, and this was their chance. People like that exist for sure. I mean, there's a whole modern phenomenon called war tourism, where people will travel to active war zones just for the thrill. I can't imagine doing that myself, but, different strokes for different folks, I guess. Or an energetic young man might be attracted to Kansas territory for the chance at looting. If you could join a band of one side or the other and you were okay with a little risk, then maybe looting the homes of the enemy could be a quick way to make yourself a little money. That's not exactly unprecedented either. The possibility of plunder has been a pretty common way of motivating soldiers throughout the history of pre-modern warfare. But also, there are some people out there who are just kind of sadistic. They enjoy fighting, or they enjoy hurting or killing other people. I think those people are probably pretty rare, but they do exist, and active conflict zones, where it's easier to get away with violence, will tend to attract them. People in any of those categories might claim a cause that they want to fight for, but for them, the cause is really just an excuse. Now, when we start talking about these kinds of people, we get into the realm of motives, which, as I've said before, are hard to know, if not impossible. So I won't try to claim that any particular individuals in this period were of this strain of people, but the reason I bring this up is to point out the fact that people like this were undoubtedly making their way into Kansas by this time. People who may have claimed a cause either pro or anti-slavery, but were really in it for plunder or adventure or just violence. Goodrich quotes a Nebraska journalist who wrote of witnessing some men from Lane's army of the North march past his window. Quote, "Each man carried a bowie knife, a revolver, a pair of breeches, a shirt, and a very don't-care-a-damn expression. The stews and brothels, the hospitals and poorhouses of the East can furnish thousands more of just such scary, scurvy scapegoats who will rejoice in a fancy jaunt to Kansas. We are in favor of Kansas becoming a free state. We hope it will. But if freedom has so far fallen from her high estate that she has to use such men, such means, and such measures as are now being employed to disgrace the name of freedom, then indeed have the American people mistaken the character of their patron saint. We believe that the very worst type of men from the North are in Kansas, and that they have the pleasure of meeting there with the very worst rowdies of the South. The two armies in Kansas are composed of the dregs of the respective parties." End quote. Once there are a significant number of people involved who have a vested interest in seeing the violence continue, the train becomes that much harder to stop. Of course, the energetic young men coming into Kansas itching for a fight would have to organize themselves somehow, and that's where the Danites come in. The name Danite is a biblical name. Its original meaning is son of Dan, or a member of the Israelite tribe of Dan from the Old Testament. Samson was a Danite. You'll remember John Brown's reference to him from Part 2. There's a little book called The Secret Danites, Kansas First Jayhawkers by Todd Mildfeld. Mildfeld based this book on the writings of a Polish immigrant named Charles Leonhardt, who came to Massachusetts in the early 1850s before eventually going to Kansas and becoming a prominent Kansas Danite. To me, the Danites are one of the most wild and fascinating things about the Kansas territorial period. The first mention I remember seeing of the group was in Robert Collins' biography of Jim Lane, and I'm just going to read you this because before I go on, I want you to experience just a little of what I experienced when I first came across the topic. While talking about an open call for violence Jim Lane issued in an 1857 speech in Leavenworth, Collins writes, quote, "Why should Jim Lane issue such a call? It appears quite intemperate for an aspiring senator to urge his supporters to set upon their opponents and kill them. One reason for such red meat rhetoric, one that some of his critics have leapt upon, was his association with a secret society known as the Danites. But here, as in many other aspects of Lane's life, there is a great deal of confusion. Much depends on partisan writings published long after these events were part of history. Recently, author Todd Mildfeld wrote a biography of one of the more radical actors of the period. His book is also the first about the Kansas Danites. He found that the Danites were established late in 1855 in response to the secret groups Missourians created to push the cause for slavery in Kansas Territory. The term Danite springs from the Bible and means the sons of Dan. Implied within the term is some ideal of a warrior for God. The Mormons picked up on that ideal in the late 1830s while living in Missouri. This group was often persecuted by their Protestant Missouri neighbors for their unconventional religious practices, so a radical band of Mormons established the Danites to fight back against persecution. The Mormon Danites failed in their efforts in Missouri and disbanded, but the group was reformed in the 1850s when the Mormons came into conflict with the government in Washington. It was this second group of Mormon Danites that became the more well-known of the two bands. Early on in Kansas, Lane, Charles Robinson, and most of the Free State leadership joined the Danites. Robinson dropped out of the Danites when he became interested in nonviolent resistance, but Lane remained, and at one point was their leader. According to James Legate, quoted in Richard Hinton's book about John Brown, Lane also did in the organization. He was continuously calling meetings in which some man would be singled out as a pro-slavery hellhound. A call would be issued for his case to be investigated and adjudicated, and if found guilty, there would be a decree issued for the man's execution. Lane's whereas killed the society, Legate wrote, referring to the initial report on the hellhound in question. The radical whom Todd Mildfelt wrote about, Charles Leonhardt, felt the same way. End quote. Collins goes on to say more about the Danites, but if you're like me, you read that and go, wait, what? You're telling me there was a secret society descended from Mormons that Robinson, Lane, and most of the Free State leadership were members of? So, of course, I had to go read Mildfelt's book, and it did not disappoint. But it actually turns out that the idea of a secret society is maybe not as surprising as it sounds, weirdly enough. Mildfelt writes, quote, "Secret groups were certainly nothing new to the United States in the mid-1850s, and as there were already secret societies both for and against slavery, it was natural they found their way into Kansas, with both sides pushing settlers to go and stake a claim there. On the pro-slavery side, there were the Blue Lodges, social bands, and Dark Lantern societies. Liberate Spring, 1885, related that, for the election in 1854, Western Missouri was armed and equipped to assail abolitionists in the territory. For this purpose, Blue Lodges, a species of semi-secret counter-Massachusetts societies designed to operate at Kansas elections, had been extensively organized. The 29th of November, at all events, would afford opportunity for a little experimenting to see what seeds of promise lay in the Blue Lodges. And he credits these organizations for the large number, 1,729, of illegal votes by Missourians." End quote. I'll just let Mildfelt keep explaining the origins of the Danites, and he'll expand on what Collins was saying. A little later in his book, he writes, quote, "Returning to December 1855 and the end of the Wakarusa War, we pick up again the formation of the Danites. An interesting choice of names. The word Danite, or literally son of Dan, is first found in the Bible mentioned in the book of Judges, chapter 13, verse 2. As the children of Israel had sinned, the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Philistines 40 years. And there was a certain man of Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren, and bare not. Manoah's wife did bear him a son after a visit from an angel, and the son's name was Samson. In chapter 18, Danite is mentioned again. In those days there was no king in Israel, and in those days the tribe of the Danites sought them an inheritance to dwell in. And the children of Dan sent of their family 5 men from their coasts, men of valor, to spy out the land. These men determined that the land called Laish was good and worth taking, and told their brethren they will fight for this land. And there went from thence of the family of the Danites, out of Zorah and out of Eshtaol, 600 men appointed with weapons of war. These 600 men and the 5 went to Laish, to Micah's house, and took his priests and graven images. They smote them with the edge of the sword, and burnt the city with fire. They built their own city, called Dan, and the priests of Micah became their priests. From these passages, one can deduce the meaning of a Danite to be a member of the tribe of Dan, but more specifically, one that is good with weapons and sent on a mission to take new lands. Certainly, the relationship to what was happening in Kansas was not lost on the men of Lawrence. I have found no mention of the word Danite between its biblical usage and the 1800s when it first appeared with reference to a secret group associated with the Mormons in 1838. The Mormons, after organizing their church in New York, moved into Missouri and were harassed and persecuted in Jackson County, and later Clay and Caldwell counties. A small group of Mormons were organized from members that had become more radical in how they wanted to deal with the persecution, and began trying to fight back. This Mormon group, called Daughters of Zion, Destroying Angels, and finally Danites, tried to operate as a secret group charged with protecting the Mormons from the Gentiles. Led by Jared Carter and Samson Avard, this group had little success in preventing attacks on the Mormons in Missouri. Later, after the Mormons had moved to Utah, a Danite group was again active as trouble broke out between the Mormons and the federal government and parties of settlers moving west. Leonhardt was aware of the Mormon Danites and later wrote, "The secret order of the Kansas Danites must have strayed from the Pacific slope. The Danites of Utah were known as the Destroying Angels in their attempt to resist the march of the Gentiles among them. They fought to perpetuate a most peculiar institution, we here in Kansas to annihilate a very heinous one." The Danite group organized in Lawrence in 1855 initially was formed as a protection group and was not inclined to offensive behavior. Its lack of action and Lane's preoccupation with minutia are given as reasons for its end. This Danite group that formed in Lawrence met in the Masonic Hall and had a Grand Master, priests, and other levels of degrees, a secret grip and signs, its own secret cipher, and a secret oath. End quote. The Danites will become a bigger deal later in the timeline, but the reason I bring them up now is because this is when they allegedly committed one of their earliest acts of violence. Mildfelt writes, quote, "The story of the alleged massacre relates that the pro-slavery group John Brown defeated at Blackjack, the Kickapoo Rangers, had among their company a number of undisciplined rowdies that were in favor of extreme violence and mayhem. Those men were kicked out from the group by Captain Pate, and henceforth formed their own band that preyed on travelers south of Lawrence, stealing slaves and reselling them in Missouri. The group's location was discovered one night after they had been drinking. A company of men then gathered in Lawrence, pursued the renegades, and surrounded them at their camp along the bank of Appanoose Creek in present-day Franklin County. The following account was included in a book published by James Redpath in 1859. End quote. Before I read the account from Redpath, the reason Mildfelt says alleged massacre is that, like so much else in this period, the reliability of the sources on this is a little suspect. The group that split off from the Kickapoo Rangers was known as the Shannon Guards, but Redpath writes blanks in his account to avoid identifying them, as well as redacting the names of Henry Clay Pate and one other man who I'll talk about in a minute. It seems like Redpath was trying to protect the anonymity of his sources or something like that. He also quotes an unnamed friend who told him about this incident. It wasn't until the year 1900 that Richard Hinton, a former Danite, filled in the blanks of Redpath's account, claimed to be the unnamed friend that Redpath heard the story from, and identified the Missourian group as the Shannon Guards. Hinton also identified Charles Leonhardt as the leader of the Lawrence band involved here, and as if this wasn't foggy enough already, there's confusion over that too. Because as it turns out, there was another Danite named Charlie Lenhart, who is not the same person as Charles Leonhardt. But also, Leonhardt's name is often misspelled as Lenhart, so sort that one out. Mildfelt has a whole chapter going over that confusion. So Hinton said that Leonhardt was the leader of the Danite band, but Mildfelt says he couldn't have been there because this incident took place in the late summer or fall of 1856, and Leonhardt didn't come to Kansas until January 1857. So it seems more likely that Charlie Lenhart was the leader. But anyway, I'll read the Redpath account now, and I'll just fill in the blanks as Hinton did in 1900 to try to be less confusing. And in case you're wondering, this is not from Redpath's biography of John Brown, it's from a different book called The Roving Editor, also published in 1859, and remember that the friend he mentions is Richard Hinton. And when he mentions a celebrated Free State captain, he's talking about John Brown and the Battle of Blackjack. Quote, "Fate of the Shannon Guards. But that scene was nothing compared with the charge on the Shannon Guards. Oh, God!" My friend shuddered violently. Everybody who is familiar with the history of Kansas has heard of the Shannon Guards. They were a gang of Missouri highwaymen and horse thieves who organized under the lead of Henry Clay Pate, the Kansas correspondent of a leading pro-slavery paper, when the territorial troubles first broke out in the spring of 1855. After sacking a little Free State town on the Santa Fe Road and committing other petty robberies and misdemeanors, they were attacked in the summer of '56 by a celebrated Free State captain and defeated by a force of less than one-half their numerical strength. They were kept as prisoners until released by the troops. Captain Pate, satisfied with his laurels, then retired from the tented field. But the company continued to exist and still lived by robbery. Shortly after the Xenophon of the Kansas prairies left them, they elected, as their captain, a ruffian of most infamous character and brutal nature. He presently was known to have committed outrages on the persons of 3 Free State mothers. I will now report the narrative of my friend. Now he quotes Richard Hinton. Captain Linhart and the boys, when they were convinced of the crimes these marauders had committed, resolved to follow them and fight them until the very last man was either banished or exterminated. We heard one night that they were encamped in a ravine near Appanoose. We cleaned our guns, filled our cartridge boxes with ammunition, and left our quarters with as stern a purpose as ever animated men since hostilities were known. It was about midnight when we began our march. A cold, misty, disagreeable night. We marched in silence until we came within a mile of the ravine. Then the captain ordered us to halt. There were 30 men of us. He divided us into 2 companies or platoons in order to get the highwaymen between a crossfire. We could see their camp lights twinkling in the distance. We then made an extended detour and slowly approached the ravine. Not a word was spoken. Every man stepped slowly and cautiously and held in his breath as we drew near the camp of the enemy. We knelt down until we heard a crackling noise among the brush on the opposing side, which announced the presence and approach of our other platoon. The Shannon Guards heard it too, and sprang to their feet. They numbered 22 men. Our captain then, in a deep, resounding voice, gave the order, "Attention, company!" The Shannon Guards, hitherto huddled together around the fires, tried to form in line and seize their arms. But it was too late. "Take aim!" Every man of us took a steady aim at the marauders, whose bodies the campfires fatally exposed. "Fire!" Hardly had the terrible word been uttered ere the roar of 30 rifles, simultaneously discharged, was succeeded by the wildest, most unearthly shriek that ever rose from mortals since the earth was peopled. I saw 2 of them leap fearfully into the air. I saw no more. I heard no more. That shriek unmanned me. I reeled backward until I found a tree to lean against. The boys told me afterward that I had fainted. I was not ashamed of it. "March!" I obeyed the command mechanically. We marched back in truly solemn silence. I had walked a mile or 2 before I noticed that the other platoon was not with us. I asked where it was. "Burying them," was the brief and significant response. "Were they all killed then?" "Every one of them." I shuddered then. I can't think of it yet without shuddering. Back to Redpath. My friend did not speak figuratively when he said so, for he shuddered in earnest, in evident pain, as he related these facts. But it was not an unmanly weakness that caused it, for he instantly added, back to Hinton, "That scene haunts me. It was a terrible thing to do. But it was right. A grand act of retributive justice. And I thank God now that I was in at the death of those marauders. No one ever missed them. They were friendless vagrants. God help them. I hope the stern lesson taught them humanity. What do you think of it? Don't you think it was right?" And back to Redpath. "It was the grandest American act since Bunker Hill," I said. End quote. As the summer of 1856 dragged on into fall, the tide in the Lawrence-Topeka region was turning in favor of the Free State movement. Between Lane and Walker's campaign to take Franklin, Saunders, and Titus, the influx of new Free State settlers with Lane's Army of the North, and the South's failure to match their numbers, the pro-slave party was slowly but surely losing its grip on the region around Topeka and Lawrence. Goodrich says that by the time September rolled around, Topeka was basically an armed camp populated by exactly the kind of militaristic young men who formed the Danites and other similar organizations. Lecompton was one of the last major pro-slave settlements in the area, and it was situated directly between Topeka and Lawrence. It was also the territorial capital, and as such, the government there was getting nervous about the growing power of the Free State militia both to the east and the west. The Free State militia had been devastating the country around Lecompton, in the usual manner of burning homes, looting, and driving out settlers, but as yet they hadn't made any move against the capital itself due to the garrison of federal troops there. The commander of the garrison, Lieutenant Colonel Philip St. George Cook, was a man with obvious Free State sympathies and had pretty much demonstrated by now that he wouldn't lift a finger to protect the pro-slave settlers in the area. But if Lecompton were attacked directly, then Cook would be forced to defend the town for appearance's sake, if nothing else. The Free State militia knew that, and so they refrained from attacking the town to avoid a potential clash with federal troops. Cook showed his Free State sympathies on September 2nd, when Acting Governor Daniel Woodson ordered him to take his garrison to Topeka and disarm and disperse the insurrectionist Free State militia gathered there. Cook simply refused the order. Over the next 2 days, the Free State militia in Topeka took the opportunity to attack the neighboring village of Tecumseh with impunity. On the 3rd, about 50 of them looted homes there and harassed the pro-slavery residents. Then on the 4th, encouraged by the complete lack of any hint of a response from Cook's garrison, 200 Free Staters came back to the village, this time bringing a whole wagon train for the purpose of carrying off plunder. And plunder they did, completely gutting Tecumseh of all its valuables. Meanwhile, Lane and Walker were in Lawrence planning their next move, and they put it into action on September 4th. The plan was a two-pronged attack on Lecompton, which Lane was apparently audacious enough to attempt, despite the federal garrison. Remember, there were still prisoners being held there, including Charles Robinson, so the attack would hopefully serve the dual purpose of capturing the pro-slavery capital and freeing the prisoners. Lane marched out the California Road from Lawrence with 800 men and sent another 100 men under James Harvey to cross to the north bank of the Kansas River and envelop Lecompton from that direction. But the plan went awry pretty much right off the bat, which isn't terribly surprising given the lack of military training and discipline that we keep bringing up. From Goodrich, quote, "Since the attack on Titus 2 weeks ago, the Lecompton region had been devastated by roving guerrilla bands. Columns of black smoke rolled skyward on a daily basis, and the few homes still standing were mostly deserted. While some pro-slavery settlers had fled to Missouri, more sought safety at the capital, where they huddled 2, 3, even 4 families to a dwelling. Several hundred fighting men and 2 cannons defended the village, but it was not enough to prevent panic when Harvey and his Free Staters were spotted across the river on the morning of September 5th. To the town's great relief, however, Harvey soon decamped. Having spent a miserable night enduring a terrible storm, the Chicagoan promptly returned to Lawrence when Lane and the main force failed to appear at dawn as expected. It was not until later that afternoon that Lane finally reached Lecompton. Planting his artillery and deploying his men on a high ridge just east of town, the Free State leader then sent Sam Walker and a company of cavalry to the heights southwest of the capital to cut off retreat in that direction. The town was thoroughly frightened, said Walker, and we could see them running here and there, and some swimming the river to escape. Not everyone in Lecompton was running or swimming. While a number of Southerners took cover in the foundation of the partially completed capital, an even larger force, which included Axala Hoole, marched forth to fight. Now quoting Hoole, "We came in gunshot of each other. We had strict orders not to fire until they made the attack, but some of our boys would not be restrained. I was a rifleman and one of the skirmishers, but did all that I could to restrain our men, though I itched all over to shoot. I did not see a pale face in our whole army. Every man seemed keen to fight. I, for one, did not feel as nervous as I am when I go to shoot a beef or turkey. End quote. In the meantime, acting Governor Woodson called on Cook's garrison to defend the town, and this time Cook couldn't very well refuse with an attack on the capital imminent, as much as he might have liked to. As soon as the federal troops approached, Lane ducked into the ranks and pretended to be a regular soldier, leaving Walker as the surprised commander of the force who would have to negotiate with Cook. Walker wrote later, quote, "When Cook came in sight of my men, he formed 4 quadrants in line and charged us, sword in hand. I said to my men, 'Sit still and don't make a move. We have done nothing, and they dare not ride over us.' The colonel, seeing that we were not frightened, called a halt when he got within 100 yards of us, and riding up he called out to me, 'Walker, what in blank are you doing here?' 'We are after our prisoners,' I replied. 'How many men have you?' 'About 400 foot and 200 horseback.' 'Well, I have 600 men and 6 cannon, and you can't fight here except with me.' 'I don't care a damn how many men you have. We are going to have our prisoners or a big fight.' 'Don't make a fool of yourself, Walker. You can't fight here. Show me to General Lane.'" End quote. But Lane feared arrest and wasn't about to reveal himself. Monahan continues the story. Quote, "Walker replied that Lane was not in command. If the lieutenant colonel wished to confer with the leaders, however, he would call a council of war. Walker turned in his saddle and gave instructions to his aides. Soon the officers trotted up the hill and sat on their horses in a circle around the lieutenant colonel. 'You have made a most unfortunate move for yourselves,' Cook told them. 'The Missourians, you know, have gone, and the militia have nearly gone, having commenced crossing yesterday to my knowledge. As to the prisoners, whilst I will make no terms with you, I can inform you that they were promised to be released yesterday morning.' The assembled horsemen asked for particulars, and, as Cook replied, a United States deputy marshal rode into the circle demanding the arrest of Walker and Lane. 'Go to hell,' Cook snapped at him, 'or rather go back to your camp.' The marshal, white as a cloth, replied shamefacedly that he dared not. Every tree, stump, and rock on the way was topped by a gun pointed at him, and the hammers were cocked. Walker agreed to escort the man out of his lines and to order the army dispersed if the prisoners were given up at once. With this, Lieutenant Colonel Cook galloped back to town. He met Jones, greatly excited. The sheriff wanted Lane arrested, even if the deputy did not. Cook, happy to have averted hostilities, said that he would help with no arrests that night. Then, recalling his military instruction to act under the governor's orders, he took acting Governor Woodson to one side and said, "If you want him arrested, write your requisition, but I think, on reflection, you will hardly make it." Woodson understood the meaning of Cook's statement. He, too, had seen the determined men surrounding the capital and decided to let sleeping lions alone. The 3 weeks he had been in office had stirred up sufficient violence already. End quote. Cook was apparently pleased with himself for averting bloodshed and wrote later, quote, "Lecompton and its defenders were outnumbered and apparently in the power of a determined force. Americans thus stood face to face in hostile array and most earnest of purpose. As I marched back over these beautiful hills, all crowned with moving troops and marching men, I rejoiced that I had stayed the madness of the hour and prevented, on almost any terms, the fratricidal onslaught of countrymen and fellow citizens." End quote. I'll agree that it's nice there was no battle with federal troops at Lecompton, but really, stopping that was a little bit like stopping one line of dominoes from falling when a bunch have already fallen, and there's also 4 or 5 other lines still falling that you can't do anything about. I mean, things were well out of control by now. Daniel Woodson was just an acting governor appointed for the time between Wilson Shannon's resignation and the arrival in the territory of President Pierce's next pick for the office, John W. Geary, the 3rd governor Kansas Territory had seen in its first 2 years of existence. And given the situation, I'd imagine Woodson was greatly relieved to hear when Geary showed up in Leavenworth a few days after the Lecompton affair. Gary was a tough, no-nonsense Pennsylvanian, a Mexican war veteran who'd been wounded 5 times while leading the 2nd Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment at Chapultepec. After the war, he spent some time in California during the Gold Rush days, including a term as the first mayor of San Francisco in 1850 and 51. He'd had some loose association with Charles Robinson in California. Geary came in confident to his new post as territorial governor. He knew things were chaotic, and if anything, probably believed things were even more chaotic than they actually were, given that up to now he'd been getting his information about the territory from exaggerated rumors and newspaper stories filtering back east. Not to mention the report of ex-Governor Shannon, who he chanced to run into during his steamboat trip up the Missouri River. Geary's secretary, John Gehan, wrote the following of their encounter with Shannon. Quote, "The ex-governor was greatly agitated. He had fled in haste and terror from the territory, and seemed still to be laboring under an apprehension for his personal safety. His description of Kansas was suggestive of everything that is frightful and horrible. Its condition was deplorable in the extreme. The whole territory was in a state of insurrection, and a destructive civil war was devastating the country. Murder ran rampant, and the roads were everywhere strewn with the bodies of slaughtered men." End quote. So Geary knew well that things were bad, but he was confident. He'd governed rough and rowdy 49ers in California. He knew the breed, and he figured the warring Kansas factions couldn't be any worse than them. But even so, the sights he saw during the steamboat trip were enough to give him some pause. Gehan described the scene as their steamboat, the Keystone, pulled into Glasgow, Missouri, the same town where they met Shannon. Quote, "On approaching the town, a most stirring scene was presented. The entire population of the city and surrounding neighborhood was assembled upon the high bank overlooking the river, and all appeared to be laboring under a state of extraordinary excitement. Whites and blacks, men, women, and children, of all ages, were crowded together in one confused mass, or hurrying hither and yon, as though some terrible event was about to transpire. A large brass field piece was mounted in a prominent position, and belched forth a fiery flame and deafened the ear with its thundering warlike sounds. When the Keystone touched the landing, a party of about 60 Missouri volunteers for the Kansas militia descended the hill, dragging their cannon with them, and ranged themselves along the shore. Each one carried some description of firearm, not 2 of which were alike. There were muskets, carbines, rifles, shotguns, and pistols of every size, quality, shape, and style. Some of them were in good condition, but others were unfit to shoot robins or tomtits." End quote. That warlike impression only got stronger as the steamboat continued up the river and drew closer to Kansas territory. Gehan continues, quote, "Active preparations for war were discernible at all the river towns. At Lexington, a large crowd was assembled on the levee, many of the persons composing it loaded with arms. But at Kansas City, the warlike demonstrations were still greater. The Keystone no sooner touched the shore at Kansas City than she was boarded by a half-dozen or more of the leading ruffians, who dashed through the cabins and over the decks, inspecting the passengers and the staterooms to satisfy themselves that no abolitionists were on board." End quote. When Geary reached Leavenworth, he found the town in a state of siege preparation. The approaches to town were barricaded with upturned wagons and the barricade manned by pro-slavery militiamen, edgy over the recent news of Lane and Walker's attacks on the forts around Lawrence the previous month. Also at Leavenworth, Geary must have heard of an incident from earlier in September in the town. Remember William Phillips? We talked about him in part 1. Way back in the spring of 1855, before even the murder of Charles Dow, he and his friend Cole McCrae had been involved in an incident where they heckled pro-slavery speaker Malcolm Clark. That led to an altercation where McCrae shot and killed Clark, and Phillips was tarred and feathered by an angry mob and run out of town. Well, Phillips came back and stayed in Leavenworth and somehow didn't have any more violence done to him until September 1st of 1856. On that day, he was in the home of his brother Gerald when another angry mob got it in their head to search and disarm the few Free State homes in town in response to Lane's attacks. Goodrich quotes an eyewitness who said the following as the mob approached the home. Quote, "Phillips, supposing he was to be driven out of house and home, resolved not to submit to the indignity, and bravely took the initiative himself. Standing boldly out upon the veranda of his house, when the ruffians drew up in front of it, he fired upon them, killing 2 of their number. They instantly directed a volley of bullets at him and the house, and Phillips fell, pierced in a dozen places, the door casing being literally riddled with the leaden storm. He expired almost instantly in the presence of his wife and another lady. His brother, who was with him, had his arm so badly broken with bullets that he was compelled to submit to an amputation." End quote. That was just the start of what became a 2-day full-scale riot in Leavenworth. The mob ran wild, driving some 200 Free State families out of their homes and either scattering them out of town or herding them onto steamboats headed out of the territory. Geary was figuring out just how serious the situation was, and it didn't get any better after he left Leavenworth. He left the river there and set off for the capital at Lecompton in a carriage, with an escort of federal troops going along in a wagon to guard against potential attack by Lane's army. All along the way, he could see the signs of devastation. Countless piles of ash with chimneys sticking out of them to mark where homes had once been. Just a short distance out of Leavenworth, the wisdom of the decision to take an escort became apparent. Gihon writes, quote, "Upon reaching an elevated piece of ground, we saw 6 horsemen crossing the prairie at a distance of about half a mile. Upon observing the carriage, they turned toward it, putting their horses to a gallop, with the evident intention to attack and rob it. As they came within a few hundred yards, the covered wagon ascended the hill, thus exhibiting the character and strength of the governor's party, when the intended assailants instantly turned and fled in the opposite direction. They were pursued by the sergeant, the only mounted man in the company, and a more interesting chase was never witnessed. The horses were put to their utmost speed, their tails standing straight out, and making time rarely equaled on a race course." End quote. By the time he got to Lecompton, Geary was fully aware of the seriousness of the situation. His report back to Washington on arrival included the following, quote, "It is no exaggeration to say that the existing difficulties are of a far more complicated character than I had anticipated. The actual pro-slavery settlers of the territory are generally as well-disposed persons as are to be found in most communities, but there are among them a few troublesome agitators who labor assiduously to keep alive the prevailing sentiment. It is also true that among the Free Soil residents are many peaceable and useful citizens, and if uninfluenced by aspiring demagogues would commit no unlawful act. But many of these, too, have been rendered turbulent by officious meddlers from abroad. The chief of these is Lane. No man's life is safe. The roads are filled with armed robbers, and murders for mere plunder are of daily occurrence. Almost every farmhouse is deserted, and no traveler has the temerity to venture upon the highway without an escort. Such is the condition of Kansas fairly pictured. It can be no worse." End quote. Geary showed himself to be basically after the restoration of law and order in the territory. The way he saw it, this was a conflict driven by extremist demagogues on both sides that was devastating the territory unnecessarily, while the vast majority of regular people suffered the consequences. His role would be to show strength as a leader and punish the demagogues and ringleaders without showing favoritism to either side. He said as much in a speech to Free Staters in Topeka shortly after his arrival. Quote, "Gentlemen, I come not to treat with you, but to govern you. There is now in the territory no other governor than myself. I will protect the lives and property of every peace-loving and law-abiding citizen with all the power I possess. I will punish every lawbreaker. Don't talk to me about slavery or freedom, Free State men or pro-slavery men, until we have restored the benign influence of peace to the country, until we have punished the murderer and driven out the bandit and rabble. Do not, I pray you, attempt to embarrass me with your political disputations. This is no time to talk about party, when men, women, and children are hourly being murdered at their own firesides, or whilst sleeping in their beds, or are being driven by merciless bands of marauders from their homes without money, food, or clothing." End quote. But as rough and ready as Geary was, it remained to be seen how effective his approach would be. Among his first acts as governor were to order all militias to disperse, to release the prisoners being held at Lecompton, including Charles Robinson, and to ask Washington for the removal of some key federal officials hated by the Free State movement, including Judge Lecompte. Some of the settlers were not as confident in his abilities as he was himself. One of those was Sam Walker, who told him, quote, "Mark my word, you'll take the Underground Railroad out of Kansas in 6 months." End quote. And Geary responded, quote, "I'll show you and all the damned rascals that I'm governor of Kansas. The administration is behind me." End quote. And that exchange comes from Monahan's book. But you can bet that calming things down wasn't going to be as simple as giving orders, because those demagogues that Geary saw as stirring things up were still hard at work, and chief among them was Jim Lane. While Geary was on his way to Lecompton, Lane was north of Lawrence playing a cat-and-mouse game with the Kickapoo Rangers and some South Carolinians under John Robertson. If I was to try to come up with an understandable military objective for Lane's forces around this time, it might have something to do with clearing the area between Lawrence and the Nebraska border for more Free State settlers to come in by that route. Or it could be that he'd just run into the Rangers while making one of his many trips to Nebraska and back. But again, military objectives are always hazy for this time, and it's just as likely that Lane and his men were just finding pro-slavery settlers to loot, and Robertson and his men were doing the same thing and going after Free Staters. On September 12th, both Lane's and Robertson's forces attacked and looted 2 separate settlements on the Grasshopper River directly north of Lecompton. Lane's band looted Ozaki, and Robertson's looted Grasshopper Falls. By the way, fun fact about Grasshopper Falls, it's not called by that name anymore. Today it's known as Valley Falls, and the Grasshopper River is known as the Delaware River today. And that's because in 1870, that area saw a massive grasshopper invasion that killed everyone's crops and caused a serious food shortage, so I guess they didn't want things to be named after grasshoppers after that, so they renamed the town and the river. But that was later. After Lane and Robertson finished their raids on Ozaki and Grasshopper Falls, respectively, their 2 forces bumped into each other near Hickory Point the next day. We talked about a Hickory Point earlier, and that's actually not the same place. There are 2 settlements called Hickory Point. The one from earlier was south of the Kansas River in the neighborhood of modern-day Baldwin City. This one is north of the Kansas River near modern-day Valley Falls. To kind of give you the lay of the land, you have Lecompton on the Kansas River, right at its confluence with the Grasshopper River. The Grasshopper River flows in from pretty much straight north. Follow that river about 7 or 8 miles north and you get to Ozaki. Keep going another 8 miles or so and you get to Grasshopper Falls. Then Hickory Point is maybe 5 miles to the east of Grasshopper Falls and slightly south. So Lane and Robertson met at that Hickory Point. Lane had maybe 100 men with him, and Robertson only had about 30. So as soon as the forces made contact, Robertson's men took refuge in the log buildings of Hickory Point, a store, hotel, and blacksmith shop. A similar number of Hickory Point locals hunkered down alongside them and prepared to fight it out too. Goodrich quotes extensively from one of Lane's men named Samuel Reeder, who later wrote about this fight. No relation to ex-Governor Andrew Reeder, as far as I know. Reeder says, quote, "General Lane soon made his dispositions for attack. The cavalry were formed to the south of the road. They crossed the stream and occupied an elevation about 400 yards southeast of Hickory Point. As my steed seemed hardly in fighting trim, I tied him to one of the wagons and fell in with the infantry. Our formation was 1 rank, and we had at least 50 men. We had all sorts of guns. Perhaps not more than 1/3 of our force had Sharps rifles, and there were a good many condemned United States rifles and muskets. The rest of us were armed with sporting rifles and shotguns. We were now all ready for the work before us. General Lane was in the saddle less than 30 yards from where I stood, and by his side was other officers. There was a short consultation, then a horseman left the group carrying a white handkerchief tied to a ramrod. He galloped down the hill, waving his flag as he went. We saw 2 or 3 men on foot coming to meet him from the direction of the shop. They walked deliberately and met our messenger near the rising ground. The conference was very brief, and when our messenger returned, I heard him say to the general, "The leader of the gang read your summons and returned it with these words: 'Take this dirty paper back and tell him we will fight him and all the hireling cutthroats and assassins he can bring against us.'" End quote. Another fun fact about this battle, fighting on the Free State side was a 19-year-old James Butler Hickok. That's right, the man who would later become a famous lawman and gunfighter, got his start in Bleeding, Kansas, and he actually met young Bill Cody for the first time during this period as well. Anyway, Sam Reeder continues telling about the opening shots of the battle. Quote, "Look," cried someone, "there goes one of their men now." Some 500 yards to our left, we saw a man on foot with a gun on his shoulder, walking briskly in the direction of Hickory Point. A young man named Shepard left our cavalry line and dashed past out front to engage the Ranger in single combat. The attention of the entire command was enlisted. With silent, thrilling interest, we watched every moment of the actors in this possible tragedy. We could almost imagine ourselves back in the days of chivalry, as Shepard, like a gallant knight, urged his horse to its utmost speed across the slope, and rapidly neared his man. The footman saw his pursuer, and changing the direction of his course a little to the north, ran with great swiftness toward the trees and bushes on the creek. He had too much of a start to be cut off, but Shepard succeeded in getting within less than 100 yards of the Ranger. He then suddenly reined up his horse, quickly dismounted, and took deliberate aim at the fugitive. As the man saw Shepard about to fire, he stooped as he ran, so as to almost resemble a four-footed beast. I could not help mentally wishing he would not be hit. It looked cold-blooded and cruel. The white puff of smoke came, the report of the rifle followed, but the human target ran on. If hurt, the man was not disabled, and in a few moments he disappeared from view. "Well," exclaimed one of the men, "that's the first time I ever saw a man chased and shot at like a wolf." But the spectacle was not ended. We saw Shepard insert a fresh cartridge in his breech loader, swing himself into the saddle, and ride rapidly in the direction of the rising ground near the shop. When he reached it and was in full view of the enemy, he suddenly checked his horse, took a rapid aim, and fired. As he wheeled around and put spurs to his horse, a scattering volley came from the buildings. Shepard swayed in his saddle from side to side, while his horse galloped zigzag back and forth across the road as he ran in our direction. "There, he's shot," cried one. "Yes, he's falling from his horse," said another. "He'll keep his seat. He'll come out all right," was heard from all sides, as the rider straightened himself up and urged his horse up the hill. As he neared us, a friend rode forward and met him. They were both laughing when they reached our position. Shepard was unhurt. His pretense of being wounded was a ruse to induce the Rangers to cease firing. There was a reckless daring in the whole performance that was captivating, and the praise of Shepard's gallantry was heard on all sides. End quote. Shortly after Shepard's escapade, the Free Staters advanced on the village. By accounts from some of Robertson's men, the Hickory Point locals weren't up for much of a fight and were itching for surrender almost as soon as the bullets started flying. But Robertson's Rangers held strong, and Robertson even posted some men with orders to shoot any of the locals who tried to run away. This might also have been one of the very earliest occurrences of what would become famous during the war as the rebel yell. Reeder says, quote, "I could hear the sound of shots from the direction of Hickory Point, accompanied at intervals by fierce yells. A young fellow near me remarked, 'Our men must be hitting them the way they holler.' It was not that. It was the Southern war cry. Our line fought in silence so far as cheering was concerned." End quote. The shooting went on for several hours, with very little damage being done to either side. As I've said before, these were untrained men for the most part. One side was holed up in log buildings, the other side was spread out on the prairie. Reeder was apparently exhilarated by the experience of being shot at, but he describes the enemy as mostly firing too high and says their bullets, for the most part, passed harmlessly over the heads of the Free State infantry. Faced with a deadlock like this one, Lane had to choose between assault and retreat. For minimally trained militia forces with an unclear military objective, standing and exchanging fire at a distance of a couple of 100 yards was one thing, but a full-blown assault that might end in close-quarters combat was something else completely. and Lane seems to have understood that. On the other hand, he couldn't just sit here wasting ammo, and he didn't have any artillery at hand to batter down the walls of the Hickory Point buildings. Reader finishes the story. Quote, "The Rangers had now ceased firing altogether. On our side, we were wasting good powder and lead against the log walls that concealed our foe. Our own fire soon slackened and then died out completely. It was a regular deadlock. What next? A small group of men were collected about General Lane. We can drive them out, but we should lose too many men," he said. "We must wait another day and get artillery." End quote. Lane and his men retreated back in the direction of Ozaki and the Grasshopper River, but the ordeal wasn't over for Robertson and the Kickapoo Rangers. Lane already had reinforcements on the way. Several hundred men under James Harvey, along with Thomas Bickerton's cannon. They came from Ozaki, the same place Lane was headed to, but they took a different route to Hickory Point and didn't encounter the retreating Lane on their way. When Harvey showed up at Hickory Point the next day, he found the reverse of the situation he and Lane had seen at Lecompton earlier in the month. Then it had been Harvey who left before Lane got there. This time, Harvey showed up after Lane had already gone. Harvey's force was several times stronger than Lane's by numbers, plus they had the cannon, so Robertson's men didn't quite know what they were in for yet. Lane or no Lane, Harvey was going to put his cannon to use. One of the men inside the blacksmith shop gave an account of the first ball that was fired. Quote, "The first fire was the only one that was productive of material injury. It struck a musket in the hands of S.P. Peace, wounding him in the calf of the leg and breaking the gun in two, the butt striking Mr. John Ashby in the breast, laying him level with the earth. After this shot, the men watched the cannon, and whenever it was about to be fired, they would lay flat on the ground." End quote. Much like at Fort Titus, the cannonballs smashed straight through the log building, which must have been terrifying to the men inside. Another defender said, quote, "The cannonballs danced over the heads of our men, cutting all manner of capers. Westbrook and another person had the skin scraped off their backs by balls as they passed over them, and numerous slight wounds were inflicted by splinters and fragments of rock from the forge." End quote. Another defender, Albert Morrill, said, quote, "I was flat on my back, right beside the workbench, the iron vise above me, just about the middle of my body. One of the cannonballs struck the legs of the bench, and the whole bench and all of the old iron, nuts and bolts, nails and chains covered me all over, as it fell with dirt and dust. For a while the shop was foggy, but it soon cleared away. After the cannon was fired, we would all jump up and poke our rifles through the chinks in the logs and keep up a continuous fire until warned by the watch at each corner to look out for the cannon, when we would drop flat on the ground again, then get up and fire as fast as we could load." End quote. This went on for 5 hours. Sharp's rifles turned out to be more damaging to the men than the cannon, though. There was at least one defender killed and several others wounded by rifle fire, including Robertson. Still nothing decisive happened, though, until some of the Free Staters found a wagon and got it in their heads to repeat the burning hay wagon tactic that had proven successful at Franklin and Titus. But the Southerners were ready for them this time. Morrill continues, quote, "We noticed a wagon loaded with hay coming towards the shop, and no horses were attached. We at once concluded that they intended to burn us out, and we arranged, by placing 2 of our best marksmen at each corner of the shop, to watch for the legs of the men rolling the wagon, and we kept up a constant fire. The wagon came up about 75 yards, when all at once it stopped. We knew then that it was all right for us, for they got sick of it, and some of the men who were pushing the wagon had their legs broken. The wagon was set on fire and abandoned. In the shop we gave 3 cheers and kept up the firing." End quote. That was apparently the last straw for Harvey, who then decided it was time to call a truce. And the way this battle ended is just wild. Goodrich wraps up his account like this, quote, "Utterly exasperated and fully aware that the day had ended in a draw, Harvey sent forward a flag of truce. When the terms were complete, it was agreed that each side would allow the other to part in peace. Surprisingly, both Southern and Northern fighters, only moments before mortal enemies, now mixed freely, with some going so far as to share rounds of whiskey from the store. End quote. But while events were progressing at Hickory Point, yet another crisis was brewing around Lawrence. It seems Atchison and his Missourians could tell at this point that their grip on northern Kansas was slipping, and less than a week after Geary's arrival in the territory, the Missouri militia under Atchison was marching on Lawrence for a fourth time. This time with something between 2,700 and 3,000 men, according to the sources I've seen. Among their leaders were Senator Atchison, Sheriff Jones, and Henry Titus, still recovering from the wounds received in the assault on his home in August. Charles Robinson, newly released from jail, had returned to Lawrence to find the town completely transformed since the last time he'd been there. His home had been burnt in the sack, there was now a fort constructed from the gutted walls of the Free State Hotel, and there were so many new faces around from the influx of Lane's Army of the North that he was now a stranger in his own town. He barely had time to get his bearings, let alone organize any kind of a defense. So he appealed to Geary for help, and his messengers reached Lecompton late on the night of September 12th. Geary set off in the early morning hours of the 13th with 400 Federal dragoons and 4 cannon from the Lecompton garrison, and was amazed when he reached Lawrence at dawn and saw the state of the town in full military siege mode. It's worth mentioning that Geary would have been in contact primarily with Robinson during this time, and so he would have gotten the Robinson spin on basically everything he saw in Lawrence. And to make this doubly interesting, Robinson was the quote-unquote governor of the extra-legal Free State government. Monahan puts it like this, quote, Governor Robinson invited Governor Geary to a conference. The Kansas house had been burned down by the pillagers in May, and he was practically a stranger in his own town among the hundreds of newcomers who had flocked down the Lane Trail during his imprisonment. Robinson either did not know or did not care to say that many of these were Harvey's thieves, just in from a rich raid, having stolen a goodly number of horses and supplies from the Russell and Majors depot. The transportation firm was considered fair game, since its Leavenworth warehouse had been opened for the storage of equipment taken from Free State immigrants. Governor Geary had seen these thieves in the distance as he drove from Leavenworth to Lecompton, and had mistaken them for refugees. As the two governors watched the motley assemblage in the Lawrence streets, Robinson excused their possession of arms as necessary to ward off the impending invasion of border ruffians, only 4 miles away. He failed to add, if he knew, that a town committee was at that moment planning distribution of Harvey's loot as a civic bonus. Geary accepted Robinson's explanation, admitting that Americans of spirit would protect their property. This was a new attitude for an administration governor. The balding personification of John Knox looked curiously at Geary's giant military figure, the bold staring eyes, full beard, and delicate pointed nose. Could this man be representing the president? Certainly Frank Pierce must have changed his policy. First, treason prisoners had been released, and now the people were recognized as having the right to defend themselves from Missourians. Perhaps the November elections were behind it all. Did the Democrats fear losing their Free Soil northern wing more than the slave power? In any event, Robinson saw plainly that Geary did not want Lawrence destroyed. But he was unprepared for the next turn of events. As the conference terminated, travelers announced that Atchison's army was marching back to Missouri. Had peace come? Governor Geary's determined administration had succeeded admirably, so it seemed. He called a mass meeting of the Lawrence citizens, reminded them of the proclamation ordering both parties to lay down their arms, promised to make the enemy obey it, and hoped that all would return to their peaceful fields and benches in this fair and blooming land of opportunity. Then the imposing man stepped into his carriage and drove with the dragoons back to Lecompton. 24 hours later, scouts dashed into Lawrence stating that Atchison's army had not dispersed as reported, but had wheeled and was marching once more toward their city. End quote. Lawrence appealed to Geary again, who was already back in Lecompton. The Lawrence Free Staters could muster barely 200 men to man the fortified Free State Hotel and street barricades, but they prepared for a fight nonetheless. One man among them was John Brown, who wouldn't leave the territory until October. He spoke to the defenders seriously but confidently. Quote, "Gentlemen, now is probably the last opportunity you will have of seeing a fight, so that you had better do your best. If they should come up and attack us, don't yell and make a great noise, but remain perfectly silent and still. Wait till they get within 25 yards of you. Get a good object. Be sure you see the hind sight of your gun. Then fire. A great deal of powder and lead and very precious time is wasted by shooting too high. You had better aim at their legs than at their heads. In either case, be sure of the hind sights of your guns. It is from the neglect of this that I myself have so many times escaped, for if all the bullets that have ever been aimed at me had hit, I should have been as full of holes as a riddle." End quote. On the afternoon of September 14th, the Missourian advance guard of about 100 men under Sheriff Jones rode towards the town. Julia Lovejoy wrote her account of how the first skirmish went. Quote, "'Twas a sight sublime to see our boys, only 80 strong, headed by the gallant Captain Walker, gallop out to meet them, and then wheel and turn toward town, as though running from such overwhelming numbers, to decoy them as near as possible, and they in full chase, when our boys turned, spread out to cover as much space as possible, and then poured a volley of balls into them. The Missourians returned the fire and then retreated into a ravine behind a cornfield to screen themselves as much as possible. Our men then returned to town, and about 50 footmen marched out onto a high rolling prairie and drew themselves up in line of battle." End quote. Then from one of the defenders, an infantry captain named Joseph Cracklin, quote, "In a few minutes they made their appearance, coming out of the timber and heading towards us. As soon as they got in range, I ordered the boys to open fire. We had not fired more than a dozen shots, when looking towards town I saw quite a number of men on the run to our assistance. In the meantime, the enemy had disappeared in a hollow or ravine. As fast as my friends arrived, I placed them in line, deployed as skirmishers at 6 paces intervals, until my force amounted to 58. Not seeing anything of the enemy, I sent Ed Bond, who was mounted, to see what they were doing. We watched him until he arrived at the entrance of the ravine, where the enemy were concealed, when he stopped, leveled his rifle, and fired. He then put spurs to his pony and galloped back. I then ordered a forward movement, with my line extended as skirmishers. We had a space of half or 3/4 of a mile to cross before we would reach the ridge that separated us from the enemy. On reaching it, we discovered them just going out of the upper end of the ravine. I ordered the boys to open fire, to load and fire at will. Our whole line immediately commenced blazing away. They fired several shots in return, but they fell short. One of their men was seen to fall. They put spurs to their horses and galloped away towards Franklin." End quote. Everyone in Lawrence understood that this was just a temporary check on the advance of the Missourians, and they waited with dread for the next morning when they anticipated the full-scale attack would come. But they were relieved that night when a force of federal cavalry showed up from the unexpected direction of Fort Leavenworth to assist in the defense, led by a future Confederate general, Joseph Johnston. Geary arrived the next morning with Cook and his Lecompton garrison, and went straight to the Missourian camp to speak with Atchison and the other officers. From Monahan, quote, "Governor Geary asked the leading officers to meet with him in the cool room of a nearby clapboard house in Franklin. Here Atchison explained that their errand was peaceful. They had come only to apprehend an organized band of murderers and robbers said to be under the command of Lane, who have plundered and butchered large numbers of our fellow citizens. Atchison said that his only purpose was to overpower the band and drive it from the territory, a revealing admission. Governor Geary told him that he had just visited Lawrence. Lane and his band were not there, and destruction of the village would only aggravate matters. As a good Democrat, he wished to remind good Democrats that an attack on Lawrence might cost them the November election. He was fresh from Washington as a representative of the president and knew the wishes of the administration. Let the Missourians go home, and he, Governor Geary, would take care of the abolitionists." These positive words from a military man backed by the president had their effect. Atchison ordered his men to their homes, saying he, Geary, promised us all we wanted. Thus Lawrence was spared, and old John Brown disappeared in the sunflowers, a dangerous place for him. End quote. Atchison was a politician and would have understood Geary's appeal very well. By all indications, Geary's governorship was off to about as good of a start as it could have had. But the latest episode at Lawrence wasn't quite over because not all the leaders in Atchison's army had Atchison's good political sense. Geary rode back toward Lecompton behind a party of the Kickapoo Rangers, who were headed for the ferry there to cross the river before heading back to their homes around Leavenworth. And these men just couldn't restrain themselves, even with the governor so close and watching their every move, which they must have known about. Gihon describes the incident. Quote, "They still carried the black flag, and their cannon, guns, swords, and carriages were yet decorated with the black emblems of their murderous intentions. 6 men of this detachment, when within a few miles of Lecompton, halted by a field where a lame man named David C. Buffum was at work. They entered the field, and after robbing him of his horses, one of them shot him in the abdomen. Almost immediately after, Governor Geary arrived upon the spot and found the wounded man weltering in his blood. Although suffering the most intense agony, he was sensible of his condition. Writhing in agony, the cold sweat drops standing upon his forehead, with his expiring breath he exclaimed, 'They asked me for my horses, and I pled with them not to take them. I told them I was a cripple, a poor lame man, that I had an aged father, a deaf and dumb brother, and 2 sisters, all depending upon me for a living, and my horses were all I had with which to procure it. One of them said I was a goddamned abolitionist, and seizing me by the shoulder with one hand, he shot me with a pistol that he held in the other.' The governor was affected to tears. He had been on many a battlefield, and had been familiar with suffering and death. But, says he, I never witnessed a scene that filled my mind with so much horror. There was a peculiar significance in the looks and words of that poor dying man that I can never forget." End quote. If Robinson's spin had started to dispose Geary in favor of the Free State Party, this murder by the Kickapoo Rangers sealed the deal for him. I keep talking about Southerners shooting themselves in the foot politically, and besides the wanton, almost casual cruelty of it, this murder was definitely another case of that. But as far as Geary's sympathies go, I think fate, or chance, or whatever you want to call it, played a role for sure. Circumstance put Geary in a position where the first blatant act of violence he witnessed directly happened to be committed by the pro-slavery side. He hadn't witnessed any of the depredations of Lane and Harvey up north, for example, or if he had witnessed them during his ride from Leavenworth to Lecompton, it had just been fleeting glimpses from a distance without any clear picture of what was actually happening. Geary may not have even known about the fighting at Hickory Point until he returned to Lecompton to find some of Harvey and Lane's men under arrest by federal troops, enforcing the order for all militia forces to stand down. But if he wasn't all the way in the camp of the Free Staters by then, he was about to be. From Monahan, quote, "He arrived in Lecompton to find a detail of dragoons with a recently captured contingent of Lane's and Harvey's men, caught raiding the pro-slavery village of Hickory Point. These disheveled and bleary-eyed men might well have changed the governor's mind about guilt for all the violence in the territory, but he could not forget the haunting words of Buffum. He ordered the immediate arrest of that farmer's murderer. A culprit was brought in, and Judge Lecompte, not dismissed as Geary hoped, released him on a bond signed by Sheriff Jones, who was known not to have a dollar's worth of property. The enraged governor investigated further. He examined the circumstances behind other arrests and discovered a jail full of Free State men held on trivial or trumped-up charges. Perhaps this excused the retaliatory depredations of the notorious Jim Lane. Had Governor Geary known all that was occurring behind his back, the death of Buffum might not have influenced him so strongly. He did not know that on the day he arrived in Lecompton to assume office, Jim Lane had ridden out of Lawrence to meet James Redpath, the journalistic showman who admitted frankly that he was bringing a company to hasten civil war. On the way, Lane found many horses belonging to pro-slavery men. He decided to confiscate them for the cause. Good horses brought high prices in Nebraska and Iowa. With money in his pockets, Lane greeted the 300 or 400 overland travelers who rumbled westward daily toward Kansas. He gave them instructions about the road ahead, described the best camping places, and reminded everyone to vote in November for Fremont and thus make Kansas a free state. End quote. Despite all that, Geary's approach seemed to be working pretty well for the moment. Things quieted down again after Hickory Point and the retreat of Atchison's militia from Lawrence. There wasn't any more major fighting for the rest of 1856, and even guerrilla activity dropped off. The territory slowly began to wake up, as if out of a nightmare. You have to think about the effect of all this violence on the early development of the place. I mean, this was the frontier, and would have been a tough place to live even without the fighting. We've seen several towns at various times in states of siege. That means men manning barricades, being on watch around the clock, riding out as scouts to try to provide advance warning of the approach of enemies, and any other military duties that might come up. All of those are men not being employed in building and developing the town. And the constant threat of raids disincentivizes building anything anyway. I mean, as a settler, why would you spend the time, effort, and resources to build a nice, robust log cabin when on any given day it might just get burnt down by raiders, from either side, really? Or if you were a store owner or some kind of skilled tradesman like a blacksmith, having a large amount of inventory or equipment or anything else of value in your place of business just makes that place a more enticing target for looters. Factors like that, on top of all the actual violence and looting, really slowed down the development of the territory in 1856 and compounded all the normal problems frontier settlers would have had to face. But by now, the Free State Party finally had numbers on their side, at least in the North. The winter of 1856 to 57 would be another harsh one, so that would slow down immigration somewhat, but the trend would only continue in that direction when the spring of 1857 came around. The Free Staters were finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. Goodrich sums up the fall of 1856 this way, quote, "One reason for the relative calm that settled over Kansas in late September was that the grim chieftain, Jim Lane, had made his hasty territorial exit. Few, it seemed, mourned his loss. While admirers insisted that he and his Army of the North were responsible for the present peace, others argued just as hotly that when Lane turned his horde loose on Kansas, like a cloud of devouring locusts, it lost forever the moral high ground Charles Robinson had worked so hard to attain. Additionally, others feared that Northern aggression might even cost John Fremont the November election. When Lane turned logic on its head and lamely argued that his army had been fighting for peace, George Washington Brown simply sneered. The kind of peace which followed in their train, snapped the editor, we hope never to witness again in Kansas. The peace was the peace seen in burning towns, desolated hearthstones, and a depopulated country." Another reason for the rare quiet in Kansas was the departure of John Brown. Tired of inaction following Geary's arrival, the abolitionist rushed east to raise funds for future operations. The early onset of winter was an event that no doubt had a settling influence as well. But perhaps the greatest single reason for the mutual termination of the slavery struggle in September 1856 was simple war weariness. Though not Napoleonic by any means, either in breadth or degree, the Civil War that swept Kansas was nevertheless sharp, vicious, and pervasive. The continual stress of the guerrilla war, the day-in, day-out uncertainty of life and property, quite simply exhausted the meager resources of the territory, not only physically and financially, but emotionally as well. And for many a young free soil and pro-slavery fighter, the summer in Kansas had at long last allowed them to gain a glimpse of that much discussed and much coveted creature, the elephant. Many, like Richard Foster, had no desire to ever see the animal again. Now quoting Foster, "War is a terrible thing. I have before heard of it. I have now seen it. I have heard the balls whistling about my ears. I have stood where men were shot down as you would shoot wild beasts. I have heard the groans of the wounded and dying. I have seen the bloody corpses of the dead, and truly war is a terribly cruel thing." End quote. Although the fighting was over for the moment, the politics of the situation had yet to be resolved. The pro-slavery party still had control of all the official territorial government offices except the governorship, and they still had some cards left to play. There was another election on October 6th, and the Free State Party again protested by not participating, leading to the re-election of pro-slavery men to the legislature and the U.S. congressional delegate. 1856 was also a presidential election year. As I mentioned before, the Democrats had abandoned Franklin Pierce and decided to run James Buchanan as their nominee, and his Republican opponent was John C. Fremont. I haven't talked a lot about national level politics so far because I want to focus on events in Kansas, but it's worth taking a minute to talk about what was going on with the two major parties at this point. The Republican Party at this time was brand new, having only been founded in 1854. The Democratic Party had pretty much dominated national politics before that, but started to show some cracks over the Kansas-Nebraska Act as its northern wing generally opposed the act and its southern wing supported it. Another rift developed within the northern wing that kind of mirrored the split between radical abolitionists and moderate free staters in Kansas. The more moderate northern Democrats were somewhat split over the act. Some moderately opposed it, while some even supported it like Jim Lane did initially, while the more radical northern Democrats outright opposed the act. The Republican Party was founded by those more radical northern Democrats disaffected by their party's support for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But despite that, the Republican Party didn't take a full-on abolitionist stance at first, but rather a stance of opposition to the expansion of slavery, which is to say, a moderate free state stance in Kansas terms. That's how radical abolition was seen as at the time. Even the new upstart radical political party wouldn't take their stance. Now, this is all completely oversimplified to the point where it's probably wrong in some ways, and I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but I think it's close enough to give you the general picture of how things were on the national political stage. The point is, as we talk about the Democrats and Republicans, they may have the same names as our modern political parties, but these are not at all the same parties on an ideological level. Today we think of Republicans as conservative and Democrats as progressive, and, well, that dichotomy is wrong for other reasons that I won't go into, but in the 1850s it was completely different. The Democrats were the conservative party back then, and the Republicans were about as radically progressive as you could be while still getting traction on the national stage. So that's how things stood going into the 1856 presidential election. In addition to Buchanan and Fremont, Millard Fillmore ran as a third-party candidate for the American Party. He had already served one term as president before Pierce, but this time he only won one state, which was Maryland. The rest of the states fell out mostly along the lines you'd expect given the political alignments we just went over. Buchanan won the entire South, plus California, Illinois, Indiana, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, and Fremont took all of the New England states, plus New York, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa. That left Buchanan with a total of 19 states to Fremont's 11, with an electoral vote tally of 174 to 114, and the Democrats held on to the presidency. What that meant for Kansas was another presidential administration that was going to be supportive of the pro-slavery party. That was a problem for Geary with his growing free state sympathies, and it was also a problem for Robinson, who was trying to revive the Topeka Constitution at this point and push it through the national legislature. He made a trip back east to that end, and that's where he was when the Free State Legislature convened in Topeka in early January 1857. He left a letter for the legislature tendering his resignation as governor. He gave a couple of explanations for why he resigned, and Blackmar quotes those in his Life of Charles Robinson. The first is in a letter to the Boston Atlas from late January. Quote, Immediately after the presidential election, the people generally seemed disposed to yield everything but honor to peace, and there was apparently a desire to cooperate with any and all parties, if we might thereby secure our disenthrallment from the Shawnee Mission usurpation. A hope was cherished that our admission into the Union under the Topeka Constitution might be effected, with a proviso submitting it once more to a vote of the people. To this end I directed my efforts, and it was that all objection to the state organization from any source might be removed, as well as to be able to work more efficiently and disinterestedly in securing friends from all parties, that I proposed to create a vacancy in the office I held. Consultation was had with the leading men, as opportunity presented, and I understood the arrangement to be approved. At least I knew of no serious objections. Having no representative of the state movement at Washington, and not knowing that anyone would volunteer, I decided to go there several weeks before the legislature was to assemble. I consulted with Lieutenant Governor Roberts, and told him of my purpose to leave Kansas, provided he would attend to state matters in my absence. This he cheerfully consented to do. Had I known that Governor Roberts would not have been present at the legislature, I most certainly should not have resigned till after its adjournment, and I would not have left Kansas. Instead of abandoning the state organization, I thought I was doing all in my power to advance its prospects of success. I see it stated that my business east was to sell shares in Quindaro, etc. Nothing can be farther from the truth. I have not offered a share for sale, and do not want to sell a share until some of the money now received shall have been invested." End quote. Then he gave this explanation in a speech to a Free State Convention at Topeka in March. Quote, "Governor Geary made many great promises. He talked well, he talked long and fast, and he still talks much. I asked him if he thought there was any way in which the Topeka Constitution could get into the Union. He seemed to think it might, by a resubmission to the people, or at furthest, in addition to this, a new election of the state officers. It is well known that all manner of charges had been heaped upon me by our enemies, such as those of being an abolitionist, a disunionist, and many others, which caused me to be looked upon with a great deal of hatred by the Democratic Party. In fact, I may say that I was probably more unpopular with that party than any other man in the country. On this account, I thought there would be less of a barrier in the way of this if I were not at the head of the state government. This was the great reason for offering to resign the office I then held." End quote. Lest we forget, I'm going to remind you again that Robinson's office was completely unofficial and illegal. He was not recognized as the governor of Kansas Territory by anyone except the Free State Party within Kansas. Just in case you're confused by Robinson's use of terms like legislature, governor, office, etc., those positions are all fabrications of his own movement, just so we're clear. Anyway, the January meeting of the Topeka legislature kind of fell flat. They failed to form a quorum on the first day because not enough delegates showed up, and on the next day, Deputy Marshal Isaac Mundy came into Constitution Hall and arrested several of the members for treason, and they submitted to arrest without resistance. But when the official legislature met at Lecompton a week later, Geary started to realize that the political problems might be harder to solve than the guerrilla problems. This legislature was still solidly pro-slavery and actually had a supermajority so they could basically pass any bill they wanted over Geary's veto. And they did. Among other things, they called a constitutional convention to be held in the fall of that year to draft what would become the Lecompton Constitution, the second of Kansas' 4 attempts at a state constitution. One provision of that bill, the provision that made Geary try to veto it, was that the Lecompton Constitution would be submitted to the U.S. Congress directly after its ratification by the convention, without approval by the voters of Kansas. Of course, the thinking was that if there wasn't already a free state majority in the territory by this time, there would be soon, and the pro-slavery faction wanted to try to bypass that just like the Free Staters had done in 1855 and use the friendly federal government to their advantage. Well, Geary's attempted veto of that bill was just the beginning of his troubles. Before long, he was openly at odds with the legislature, which had promised to override any veto he made, and they followed through on that promise. But the real tipping point for Geary seems to have come in February. Lecompton was one of the roughest and wildest settlements on the frontier at this time to begin with, and was still strongly pro-slavery despite the growing Free State majority in the region as a whole. Gehan describes the state of the town sometime in early 1857. Quote, "An altercation took place between two South Carolinians. They were personal friends, but had been drinking too freely. One of them, incensed at some remark of the other, drew his pistol and fired, and was about to repeat the shot when his companion, after warning him, discharged into his body the contents of a gun loaded with buckshot. The wounded man lingered 3 or 4 days, in great agony. 2 or 3 days later, another serious shooting affair occurred. A Free State man living in the vicinity brought in a load of beef for sale. He proceeded to one of the stores, where he got into conversation, during which he denounced the institution of slavery. A quarrel and fight ensued, when the Free State man ran for his life. He was pursued to a cluster of woods on the edge of the town, his pursuers firing at him behind a tree, whence he fired a few more shots. Some of his assailants had run for guns, and succeeded in shooting him 3 times as he attempted to make his escape, the balls having entered his back, abdomen, and side. He was laid, dangerously though not mortally wounded, upon the beef on his wagon, and brought into town with his ox team. These occurrences had become so common that they attracted but little attention. Whilst this man was writhing apparently in the agonies of death on one side of the street, the groggeries opposite were filled with loungers too unconcerned to take any special notice of the circumstance." End quote. As the legislature, as well as the town as a whole, became more antagonistic towards Geary, Sam Jones resigned as sheriff of Douglas County, leaving Geary to choose a replacement. Jones' recommendation was a man named William Sherrard, and Geary refused to approve him. Goodrich describes the situation like this. Quote, "The growing antipathy among Southerners erupted in fury when, upon the resignation of Sam Jones as Douglas County Sheriff, Geary refused to commission his chosen successor, William Sherrard. Because of the reverses of the summer before, many slavers saw Sherrard as the only man capable of regaining lost ground. Sherrard had boasted, one Free Soiler remarked, that, as sheriff, within a week he would restore the border rule as it was before the advent of Geary. Hence, when the governor refused to validate the selection, the situation in Lecompton became explosive. Characterized by Alfred Jones, editor of the Lecompton Union, as a lion, well-educated and the perfect gentleman, Sherrard was depicted by others as an untamed hyena, drunken, brutal, and vicious. Mr. Sherrard had been engaged in several drunken broils, fighting and shooting at persons with pistols, and threatening others, wrote Geary, citing his reasons for denying the position to Sherrard. His habits and passions rendered him entirely unfit for the proper performance of the duties of that office." End quote. In contrast to Sam Jones, in this case, I tend to believe the sources that characterize Sherrard as a vicious thug. And that's because of what happened next. Geary and Sherrard both attended a February legislative session in Lecompton, and witnesses say Sherrard suddenly got up and left the hall at some point during the meeting. Gehan tells the story from there. Quote, "The governor remained a half hour or more, and then took his leave. As he was about to step from the main hall into the adjoining anteroom, Sherrard stood in the door, having gone off and procured an extra pistol to the one he usually wore, both of which he had placed conveniently in a belt. He also carried a huge bowie knife. Before the governor had closed the door, Sherrard accosted him with, 'You have treated me, sir, like a damned scoundrel.' The governor passed on without noticing the man. I was the last to leave the hall and enter the anteroom, when I saw Sherrard spitting after the governor, at the same time uttering oaths and threats of defiance, his right hand firmly grasping one of the pistols in his belt. Had he halted to speak to Sherrard, or turned upon him, or in any possible way given an excuse for the deed, he would have been shot down like a dog, and himself and companions riddled with balls. The anteroom is in the second story of the first building, the stairs leading to the ground being on the outside, and as the governor descended, Sherrard stood upon the platform above, with pistol in hand, hesitating whether even yet to fire or not. He followed on, and did not abandon his purpose until the length of the building was traversed, when pronouncing an audible oath, he turned off and took a different direction." End quote. Now fearing for his life, Geary sent to Fort Leavenworth asking for a personal bodyguard of federal dragoons, but was denied by the commander there, Major General Percifer Smith, the pro-slavery man who likely would have fought for the Confederacy had he not died in 1858. To show support for Geary, some of his Free State friends decided to hold what Goodrich calls a mass indignation meeting on February 18th in Lecompton. Of course, you can bet the pro-slavery men of the town, including Jones and Sherrard, would be there to disrupt the meeting. The Free Staters were able to muster a considerable crowd, apparently, and a committee passed resolutions praising Geary and condemning Sherrard. Then Gihan again picks up the account from there. Quote, "No sooner were these resolutions read than Sherrard sprang upon a pile of boards, and in a loud voice exclaimed, 'Any man who will dare to endorse these resolutions is a liar, a scoundrel, and a coward.' His manner was highly excited. He wore a large bowie knife and 2 six-shooters in his belt. A Mr. Joseph Shepard, living near Lecompton, and who stood in the midst of the crowd, quietly remarked, 'I endorse them, and am neither a liar, a scoundrel, nor a coward.' Sherrard drew a revolver, and fired all the loads as rapidly as he could pull the trigger, aiming at Shepard, though endangering the lives of others. 3 balls took effect on Shepard, and a 4th slightly wounded another person. As soon as Sherrard commenced firing, Shepard pulled off his gloves and attempted to return the shots, but his caps being wet, burst without discharging the loads, and seeing that Sherrard was about to draw his other pistol, he clubbed his revolver, rushing toward Sherrard and struck at him with the butt, Sherrard not having an opportunity to fire, returning his blows in a similar manner. They were separated, and Shepard was removed, severely wounded. Whilst Sherrard was firing, some dozen or more shots were fired by other parties. An old man, over 70 years of age, named Thomas W. Porterfield, was among the crowd. Seeing Sheriff Jones with a pistol in his hand, old Porterfield deliberately took off his spectacles and, pulling out his pocket handkerchief, wiped them carefully and again adjusted them. He then drew a Navy revolver, and having examined the caps, placed the barrel upon his left arm, and took precise aim at Sheriff Jones, waiting for him to give the first shot. As the sheriff moved about, the old man steadily eyed him, keeping his pistol all the time properly aimed. No sooner was Shepard taken off than Sherrard seized his other pistol and advanced, with finger on the trigger, toward John Jones, the young man whom he had assaulted a few days before, when Jones, perceiving his danger, also drew. Several shots were then simultaneously fired, and Sherrard fell, mortally wounded. 1 ball had struck him in the forehead, penetrating the brain, and another had grazed his side." End quote. Sam Jones described Sherrard's head wound like this, quote, "The shot fired at Sherrard took effect in the head, fracturing the skull bone as large as 10-cent pieces or larger, which were taken from his head by the physician. I also put my finger up to the joint in the wound, or hole made by the ball. I saw a portion of the brain that had come from the wound." End quote. Sherrard's death seemed to take the wind out of the sails of the pro-slavery party in Lecompton. Appointed in his place as Douglas County Sheriff was a familiar face, Jacob Branson, the same man Jones had been trying fruitlessly to arrest for 6 months, starting all the way back in 1855 after the murder of Charles Dow. The other effect of this incident was to put the final nail in the coffin for Geary. Shaken by the incident itself as well as the threats on his life, and frustrated by the antagonism of the legislature and the lack of support shown him by the pro-slavery federal government, he tendered his resignation, which became effective on March 4th, the same day Buchanan took office as president. It was 6 months, almost to the day, since Sam Walker had prophesied Geary's departure.
choose honest men. We will make the wilderness bud and bloom again. Bring the sickles, feed the plow, turn the ready soil. Freedom is the noblest pay for the true man's toil. Oh, brothers, hasten all with me. We'll sing upon and display the song of liberty. Oh, brothers, hasten all with me. We'll sing upon and display the song of liberty.
On the next episode of American Guerrillas, Lawrence might have been secure for the Free State Party, but that doesn't mean any of this was over. The Free State Party, led by Jim Lane and the Danites, goes over to the offensive and exacts retribution against the pro-slavery side for the violence of the summer of 1856, all while the nation slides closer to the brink of civil war. Well, to give you a little bit of an idea how out of hand this project has gotten, this point in the timeline is roughly where I had originally planned on getting to in the first episode. But here we are, 3 episodes and 11 plus hours of podcast later, we're still 4 years away from the Civil War proper, and it feels like we've barely even gotten started. This is what you signed up for, though, am I right? If you are enjoying it, I'd greatly appreciate your support. For every hour of podcast that makes it into the show, you can be sure I've done at least 100 hours of reading and writing to make it, if not more. Not a small task, and if you'd like to show your appreciation, you can do so on a recurring basis for $5 a month or $50 a year on Substack, and that also comes with access to paid-only articles there. For now, those are reviews of the books I'm reading for research on this series. There are 3 of those up already, maybe 4 by the time this episode goes out, including my first negative review, and there will continue to be more as I write them up. You can find that at The Unsung Substack on Substack.com, and I'll also put a link in the show notes. If you'd rather make a one-time donation, you can do that too through PayPal or Venmo. Those links are also in the show notes. Donations are never expected, but always appreciated. At this point, I'm thinking it'll probably take 2 more episodes to cover the remaining time before Fort Sumter. Look for the next one in maybe another month or so. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you'll join me again for the next one, that the deeds of men shall not go unsung.